At my daughter's wedding, after I handed her the envelope with the gift, she raised her glass, looked at me, and said that all her life she had dreamed of having a different father, and finally this dream has come true. She hugged her father-in-law, and I turned around and simply left. But when she opened it, her world fell apart. My name is Dwayne. I am 69 years old, a proud African-American man who spent 40 years buried under grease oil and diesel smoke as a heavy machinery mechanic. To the outside world, and especially to my daughter Morgan, I was just an old blue-collar laborer who smelled of the garage. They never knew that beneath my stained overalls I had silently built a massive construction supply chain. I kept my wealth invisible because my late wife Yvonne always believed that true character is forged through hard work, not flashing trophies. But my discretion became my curse. Tonight, that lack of ostentation sat me at the far corner table of the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel. I paid $40,000 in cash for this venue, yet I was treated like an unwanted ghost. I looked down at my hands resting on the crisp white linen tablecloth. My knuckles were scarred, my palms thick with permanent calluses. Across the long head table sat Trent, my new white son-in-law, alongside his aristocratic family. His father, Gregory, sat straight-backed wearing a $1,000 tuxedo and an arrogant smirk. They looked down their noses at my family, completely unaware that my silent business empire paid for their luxury. I swallowed my pride, keeping my eyes fixed ahead, waiting for the moments of absolute clarity that would soon tear their artificial world straight down to the very ground below us right now, right? The room was silent as Morgan adjusted the microphone. She looked beautiful, yet entirely cold. She cleared her throat and smiled warmly at Gregory, then turned her eyes to the rest of the room. Thank you all for being here tonight. Her voice resonated clearly through the speakers. This wedding is the beginning of my real life. Growing up, I always felt out of place. I felt like I belonged in a world of true culture refinement and success. I watched other families achieve greatness while my own father spent his days covered in industrial grease and shouting over engine noises. I was embarrassed of the garage, embarrassed of our simple life. I always dreamed of having a different father, someone who understood the corporate world and high society. Tonight, as I join this family, that dream has finally come true. Morgan raised her champagne glass high, her eyes shining with ambition. Gregory, you are the father I always wanted. Thank you for welcoming me into your world. The crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. Trent leaned over and kissed her cheek proudly. Gregory smiled grandly, nodding his head at his friends. The high society guests cheered, completely swept up in her performance. Nobody looked at me. Nobody noticed the old mechanic in the corner. They thought she had successfully traded her blue-collar past for an aristocratic future. Her voice was pure venom wrapped in silk, cutting through my heart without hesitation. I watched her hug her new white family, realizing she had completely forgotten who paid for her private school tuition, her luxury clothes, and this exact ballroom. Her arrogance was blinding her, but the fall would be swift and brutal for everyone involved in this greedy conspiracy against my life. Now the game begins right here for them all. I stood up slowly from my chair. My knees made a faint cracking sound, a physical reminder of the heavy steel beams I had lifted for calloused decades. I did not throw my glass. I did not scream at her betrayal. I simply pushed my chair back and walked toward the head table. Every step I took was deliberate, heavy with the weight of 40 years of unacknowledged labor. The high society crowd fell silent as they noticed me approaching. Morgan stopped laughing, her face freezing as I reached her side. She looked down at my rough hands, her eyes filled with immediate annoyance. She braced herself for an emotional scene, expecting me to beg for her affection or cause an embarrassing public argument. I reached into my inner tuxedo pocket and pulled out the thick white envelope. Inside was the deed to the beautiful suburban home I had bought for them, an asset worth $500,000. I placed it quietly right next to her half-empty champagne glass, ensuring it rested under the bright spotlight. I did not look into her eyes. I did not look at Trent or his smug father Gregory. I leaned down toward the microphone, keeping my voice completely calm, deep and steady. "Congratulations on your new family," I said. My words resonated through the grand ballroom like a heavy iron hammer blow. I did not wait for her response. I did not care to see the confusion on her face. I turned my back on her husband, and on the entire room of clapping strangers. I walked away with my head held high, leaving her with the envelope that would soon dismantle her entire world. They would regret this arrogant mistake for the rest of their miserable fake lives, forever more than ever. I walked out of the $40,000 venue with steady, unhurried steps. The grand marble pillars of the hotel lobby faded behind me, an expensive backdrop to my final act of paternal devotion. I had financed every luxury they enjoyed tonight, yet I left without a single regret. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped onto the wet asphalt. The valet approached quickly, handing me the keys to my 10-year-old sedan. He looked at my worn car, then at my tuxedo, his eyes showing a brief flash of confusion. I ignored his silent judgment, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The old motor hummed loudly, a familiar and honest sound that completely cleared the noise of the ballroom from my mind. As I drove through the illuminated streets of the city, the emotional weight of her betrayal began to lift, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. For years I had allowed them to treat me like an invisible ATM, convincing myself that a father's love meant silent endurance. I had tolerated Trent's subtle condescension and Morgan's growing shame of my background. That foolishly soft father died in that ballroom. A cold tactician took his place. I looked at the passenger seat where my briefcase sat holding Trent's corporate records. I knew his company was bleeding cash, built entirely on a foundation of lies and a forged signature. He desperately needed my commercial warehouse to survive his investor meeting next week. He thought I was just an uneducated laborer who could be easily discarded. He was about to find out exactly how expensive his arrogance would be. I drove home completely at peace, ready to dismantle their world. Tomorrow they will feel the first crushing blow of reality hit their perfect lives for good. The autumn morning carried a sharp chill. I sat on my wooden back porch exactly at 6 o'clock. A cup of black coffee warmed my calloused hands. The neighborhood remained perfectly quiet. My mind replayed the ballroom scene with crystalline clarity. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the mechanical precision of an engine mechanic identifying a broken part. The part was my daughter's entitlement. The fix required a complete overhaul. My phone vibrated heavily against the wooden table at exactly 10 o'clock. The caller ID displayed Trent's name. I let it ring 3 times. Let him sweat. I tapped the screen and activated the speakerphone. I placed the device down next to my coffee mug. "What the hell is this?" Trent screamed. His aristocratic tone from the wedding was completely gone. His voice cracked. He sounded like a cornered animal facing a trap. "Good morning, Trent," I replied. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "I assume you opened my wedding envelope." I heard the rustling of heavy paper on the other end of the line. Trent breathed heavily, his panic echoing loudly. "Morgan thought it was a check. She thought it was the deed to our suburban house," he yelled. The sheer terror in his voice brought a grim satisfaction to my chest. He was finally facing the man he mocked. "I gave you exactly what you earned," I said. "Nothing more and nothing less." Trent slammed his fist against a desk. The sound echoed clearly through the speaker. "This is a 30-day eviction notice. You cannot do this to me. My entire company operates inside that building. We have a signed commercial lease." I leaned back in my wooden chair. The trap I set a year ago had finally snapped shut entirely. "You had a lease," I corrected him. My voice remained perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. "You had a lease based strictly on a family trust agreement. The specific terms clearly stipulated that the property was leased at a rate of $1 per year. That highly discounted rate was entirely conditional upon the continuation of our family bond and mutual respect." I took another sip of my dark coffee. "My daughter publicly severed that bond last night in front of 150 guests. The condition is officially broken. The lease is entirely void. I bought that massive commercial lot 30 years ago by working brutal double shifts at the Baltimore shipyard. I owned the dirt. I owned the bricks. I owned the vast parking lot. Trent thought he had married a gullible old blue-collar laborer. He never bothered to read the complex legal clauses I insisted my lawyers bury deep in that $1 contract. "You are completely insane," Trent sputtered. His panic shifted rapidly into desperate, unhinged rage. "I have a massive investor meeting scheduled for next week. If we lose the warehouse headquarters, the investors will pull their funding immediately. We will go absolutely bankrupt before the month ends." I watched a single stray leaf fall onto the porch. You have a brand new father now, I stated calmly. Ask Gregory to fund your failing startup. I am absolutely sure a man of his immense culture and refinement can easily spare a commercial warehouse for his true daughter. Trent cursed loudly. I heard a sudden scuffle in the background. The sound of a woman crying grew much louder. Morgan tore the phone away from her new husband. The reality of her arrogant speech had finally materialized into total financial ruin. "Dad, you cannot be serious," Morgan cried frantically into the receiver. "You are ruining Trent's entire business over a stupid toast." Her tears carried zero weight with me now. They were tears of extreme inconvenience, not genuine remorse. "It was just a speech. I was simply trying to be nice to my new in-laws. You are taking this way too personally." I set my mug down firmly. "I am taking it factually," I replied. "You despise the oil under my fingernails. You despise my background. You despise the fact that my wealth comes from cargo ships and heavy lifting. But you have absolutely zero problem spending my money. That financial arrangement stops today." Morgan gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "You are acting like a bitter, vindictive old man." Trent snatched the phone forcefully back from her hands. "I will sue you into absolute oblivion," Trent roared. "I will bring in my elite corporate lawyers. I will tie this property up in federal court for years." "You do not understand basic business law. You are just an uneducated mechanic." I welcomed the empty threat. It proved exactly how foolish and desperate he remained. "Bring them," I commanded. "Bring every single expensive lawyer you can afford. But remember one thing, Trent. I own the building outright without a single mortgage. You have exactly 30 days to remove your servers, your inventory, and your extreme arrogance from my property. On day 31, the locks change completely." I ended the call immediately. I did not block their numbers. I needed them to keep calling. I needed to document every threat, every insult, and every desperate plea. They had no idea they had just declared war on a man who spent 4 decades systematically dismantling heavy machinery. I picked up the phone again and dialed Hayes. Hayes was a ruthless corporate litigator. He owed his entire law school tuition to a massive scholarship fund my late wife Yvonne and I established 20 years ago. He answered on the very first ring. "Hayes," I said, "Trent is going to file a rapid injunction against the commercial eviction. He will try to claim a verbal contract or sweat equity to buy time." "He has zero legal standing, Dwayne," Hayes replied instantly. "The lease agreement you forced him to sign last year automatically strips him of all tenant rights upon trust revocation. I drafted those exact clauses myself. He is entirely dead in the water." I watched a heavy delivery truck pass by my house. "He will attack my mental state next," I predicted. "He will attempt to claim I am acting erratically due to my old age. He wants a judge to freeze my assets and legally assign him guardianship over my estate." Hayes chuckled dryly through the receiver. "I anticipated that exact desperate move. I already booked a mandatory appointment for you with Dr. Eris at 2 o'clock this afternoon. It is a full neurological and comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. We will secure a certified medical document proving you possess the cognitive function of a highly sharp 40-year-old man before Trent even drafts his first frivolous lawsuit." "Perfect," I said. I finished my black coffee and walked back inside my quiet house. I headed straight to my bedroom and opened the heavy steel safe hidden securely inside the closet. I pulled out a thick manila folder containing Trent's corporate tax returns and loan applications. He carelessly left them on my kitchen table a month ago. I copied every single page. Trent's company was severely bleeding cash. He desperately needed my warehouse to fake his financial stability. I grabbed my car keys. I had a doctor to see and an arrogant son-in-law to utterly destroy. I grabbed the brass handle of my front door, fully prepared to leave for Dr. Eris's office. Before I could turn it, heavy fists pounded against the solid wood. The blows were frantic, aggressive, and highly demanding. I opened the door immediately. Trent and Morgan stood on my front porch. Trent's face was flushed dark red with extreme anger. His expensive designer suit looked wrinkled from his panic. Morgan stood directly behind him, clutching her luxury handbag against her chest like a protective shield. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her posture was entirely defensive. They did not wait for an invitation to enter. Trent tried to shove his way past me into my private foyer. I planted my heavy work boots firmly on the threshold. I raised my right arm, and placed my calloused hand flat against his chest. I stopped his forward momentum instantly. He looked down at my hand in absolute shock. He was completely unaccustomed to physical boundaries. "Move aside right now, Dwayne," Trent commanded. His voice carried the exact same arrogant entitlement he displayed at the wedding reception. "We are coming inside your house. We are going to settle this ridiculous eviction nonsense right this second." I did not drop my hand. I stared directly into his pale, panicked eyes. "You do not cross my threshold," I stated coldly. "You lost your guest privileges the exact moment you decided my daughter needed a wealthier father. State your business on the porch or leave my property immediately." Morgan gasped loudly. She stepped forward, attempting to leverage her position as my only child. "Dad, stop acting like a dictator. Let us inside the house. Trent is having a severe panic attack about the company." "His panic is not my problem," I replied. "Speak from the yard." Trent slapped my hand away from his chest furiously. He pulled a folded legal document from his jacket pocket and shoved it toward my face. "I spoke to my elite corporate counsel this morning," Trent snarled. "We are filing a massive civil lawsuit against you for breach of contract and malicious interference with a daily business operation. You cannot legally evict a fully functioning technology corporation based on a petty emotional grudge." I did not take the paper. I let it flutter silently to the wooden porch floor. "Your corporate counsel is stealing your money," I replied calmly. "You signed a family trust lease. You violated the core morality clause of that lease. My lawyers drafted that specific document to protect my assets from entitled frauds exactly like you." Trent stepped closer, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate me. He failed completely. "I built that warehouse into a modern tech hub," he shouted. "I invested $100,000 in renovations. The law grants me sweat equity. A judge will laugh you straight out of the courtroom." I looked at him with absolute pity. He truly believed his polished vocabulary could override my decades of brutal labor. "You installed cheap glass walls and bought fancy espresso machines," I said. "I bought that commercial land 30 years ago. I worked back-to-back night shifts at the Baltimore shipyard for 15 brutal years to pay off that mortgage early. My hands bled hauling heavy steel freight so I could secure that specific industrial block. I own the dirt underneath your fancy glass walls. I own the bricks surrounding your servers. I own the asphalt where you park your imported cars." Trent opened his mouth, but 0 words came out. He had never faced the true reality of my hidden wealth. "You own absolutely nothing, Trent," I continued relentlessly. "You possess a bankrupt startup running entirely on forged documents. If you file a lawsuit, my lawyers will countersue for the back rent you never paid. You will owe me $2 million by Friday." Morgan pushed violently past her husband, her face twisted into a mask of pure victimhood. She deployed the exact emotional strategy she had used since she was a teenager. Tears welled up in her eyes, perfectly on cue. "Dad, how can you be so cruel and heartless?" Her voice trembled, aiming for maximum guilt. "Mom would be absolutely disgusted with you right now. Yvonne would never let you put her only daughter out on the street to starve. She taught us to forgive our family. She taught us that family always comes first." The deliberate mention of Yvonne's name did not soften my heart. It ignited a cold, highly focused fury deep inside my chest. I looked at the daughter who had mocked my working-class life just 24 hours earlier on a brightly lit stage. "Do not dare speak your mother's name to manipulate me," I warned her. My voice dropped to a highly dangerous whisper. "Your mother worked grueling night shifts at the hospital to buy your first computer. She wore thrift store shoes so you could attend elite prep schools without feeling ashamed. She believed in hard work. She believed in character. You possess neither." Morgan flinched visibly, stepping backward away from me. The fake tears dried up instantly on her face. "I gave you everything," I continued relentlessly. "I funded your luxury lifestyle. I bought your expensive cars. I paid for a $40,000 wedding just so you could stand on a stage and call a wealthy white stranger your true father. You did not want my family values, Morgan. You only wanted my bank accounts." She shook her head desperately. "It was just a toast, Dad. I was nervous. I was just trying to impress Gregory." "You impressed him," I stated flatly. "You impressed him by showing him exactly how little respect you have for the man who financed your entire existence. Your greed blinded you. You traded a devoted father for a high society illusion. Now you get to experience the real cost of that illusion." Trent grabbed Morgan's arm forcefully. He realized their ambush had failed completely. The legal threats did not work at all. The emotional manipulation hit an unbreakable brick wall. "We are entirely done here," Trent muttered. He glared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. "You are going to die a lonely, miserable old man. My father will crush your entire empire in court." "Tell Gregory to bring his heaviest checkbook," I replied. I checked my gold wristwatch deliberately. "I have a mandatory medical appointment to attend. Your presence here is currently delaying my strict schedule." I pointed my calloused index finger directly toward the street. "Get off my porch right now. Get off my driveway. Do not return to this house without a fully armed police escort." Morgan opened her mouth to beg one last time. She saw the absolute terrifying finality in my eyes and stopped immediately. She finally understood that the infinite well of my paternal forgiveness had run completely dry. Trent dragged her aggressively down the steps toward their luxury SUV. I stood on the porch and watched them retreat in sheer panic. "The clock is ticking, Trent," I called out after them. My voice cut clearly and sharply through the crisp autumn air. "You have exactly 30 days to vacate my warehouse. Tick-tock." I stepped back inside my house and shut the heavy wooden door firmly. I turned the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. The countdown had officially started and their destruction was absolutely guaranteed. 3 days passed. I spent them finalizing the eviction paperwork for the commercial warehouse. On the morning of the 4th day, a sleek black Mercedes pulled into my driveway. Trent stepped out, completely ignoring the warning I had given him. He was not accompanied by the police. He was accompanied by a man wearing an expensive tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Morgan trailed behind them, looking down at the pavement. I opened my front door before they could even knock. I stood on the threshold, blocking their path exactly as I had done before. Trent wore a smug, victorious smile. He believed he had finally found the ultimate weapon to bypass my authority. The man in the suit stepped forward and extended a thick legal document toward me. He introduced himself as Arthur Vance, a senior partner at a prominent downtown litigation firm. I did not take the papers from his hand. I simply stared at him, waiting for the inevitable threat. Trent snatched the document from his lawyer and shoved it against my chest. He declared that he was officially filing a petition for emergency legal guardianship. He claimed my decision to evict his company was absolute proof of senile paranoia and severe cognitive decline. He stated that the court would freeze all my assets by tomorrow morning. He intended to seize total control of my estate, my warehouse, and my finances. Morgan refused to meet my eyes. She stood silently while her husband attempted to legally strip away my basic human rights. They thought I was a helpless old man who would crumble under the weight of legal jargon. They failed to realize I had already countered this exact move. A silver sedan parked directly behind the Mercedes. The timing was absolute perfection. Hayes stepped out of his car, adjusting his tie. He walked up my driveway with the calm, predatory grace of a litigator who already knew he had won the case. Trent turned around, his smug smile faltering slightly as he recognized the man approaching us. Hayes was a legal legend in Baltimore, known for destroying opposing counsel in high-stakes corporate warfare. Trent's lawyer, Arthur Vance, visibly stiffened. Hayes bypassed Trent completely and stood right beside me on the porch. He did not introduce himself. He simply reached into his own briefcase and pulled out a single, heavily stamped medical folder. He handed it directly to Vance. Hayes instructed the opposing lawyer to read the first page before he made the biggest professional mistake of his entire career. Vance opened the folder hesitantly. His eyes scanned the document rapidly. I watched the color completely drain from his face. It was the comprehensive psychiatric and neurological evaluation I had completed just 48 hours prior. It was signed and notarized by Dr. Aris, the chief of neurology at Johns Hopkins Hospital. The document certified that I possessed 0 signs of dementia, paranoia, or cognitive decline. It stated my mental acuity was functioning at the top 1% of my age group. Hayes explained that my decision to evict a tenant who violated a written contract was not a sign of senility. It was a sign of competent business management. Trent grabbed the document from his lawyer, refusing to believe the text. He stared at the signature, his hands shaking violently. His master plan to steal my wealth through a medical loophole had just crashed into an unbreakable wall of medical facts. Hayes did not give Trent a second to recover from the shock. He stepped closer to Vance and unleashed a devastating verbal assault. He detailed exactly what would happen if they proceeded with this fraudulent petition. Hayes quoted the specific state statutes regarding the filing of a frivolous guardianship claim with malicious intent. He promised to report Vance to the State Bar Association for severe ethical violations. He guaranteed a massive countersuit for defamation, emotional distress, and targeted elder abuse. Hayes made it crystal clear that he would personally ensure Vance lost his license to practice law if this petition reached a judge's desk. The threat was not empty. Hayes had the resources and the reputation to execute every single consequence. Vance closed his briefcase with a loud, definitive snap. He turned to Trent and stated that he could no longer represent him in this matter. Trent looked at his lawyer in absolute disbelief. He demanded that Vance stay and fight. He reminded the lawyer of the massive retainer fee he had supposedly paid. Vance ignored him completely. He stated that Trent had lied to him about my mental state. He refused to risk his entire career for a desperate, bankrupt client. Vance walked quickly down the driveway, got into his Mercedes, and drove away without looking back. Trent was left standing on my lawn, completely abandoned by his expensive legal shield. The arrogant tech CEO had brought a knife to a gunfight against a man who owned the entire armory. I stood silently on the porch, watching his aristocratic confidence shatter into a million jagged pieces. The legal avenue to steal my wealth was permanently barricaded. Trent realized he was completely outmatched in the legal arena. He spun around to face me, his face contorted with ugly, unmasked fury. The refined gentleman Morgan had married evaporated entirely, revealing the vicious opportunist hiding underneath. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. He screamed that he did not need a court order to destroy me. He promised to burn my reputation to the ground in the court of public opinion. He declared that nobody would believe an old blue-collar mechanic over a young, charismatic tech entrepreneur. He swore to go to the media and paint me as a deranged, controlling father who was actively trying to sabotage his own daughter's happiness out of pure jealousy. He threatened to drag my name through the mud until I begged him to take the warehouse back. Morgan watched him scream, her eyes wide with shock. She had never seen this violent, desperate side of the man she claimed was better than her own father. Trent grabbed her arm roughly and yanked her toward their luxury SUV. He ordered her to get into the car. Morgan stumbled, looking back at me with a sudden flash of profound realization. She finally saw the monster she had invited into her life. I did not move. I did not offer her a lifeline. I watched them speed away down the quiet residential street. Hayes stood beside me, adjusting his suit jacket calmly. He asked if I wanted to prepare a preemptive legal response to their inevitable public smear campaign. I shook my head slowly. I told Hayes to do absolutely nothing. I wanted Trent to speak first. I wanted him to dig his own grave in front of the entire world. The attack arrived exactly 48 hours later. It did not come in the form of a legal document. It came as a highly produced digital weapon. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the link Hayes forwarded to my phone. The screen illuminated with Morgan's face. She sat on a plush velvet sofa in her suburban living room. The lighting was soft and deliberately sympathetic. She wore a simple gray sweater stripped of her usual heavy makeup, projecting an image of absolute vulnerability. The video was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Morgan looked directly into the camera and began to cry. She told her followers a tragic story about a jealous, controlling father who could not handle his daughter finding happiness. She claimed I harbored deep, irrational resentment against her new husband's wealthy background. She completely omitted the true nature of her wedding speech. She edited out the condition of the warehouse lease entirely. Instead, she presented the eviction notice as an act of pure malice. She told the world I was throwing her husband's brilliant technology startup onto the street out of sheer spite. The camera angle shifted to show Trent sitting beside her. He wrapped a protective arm around her trembling shoulders, playing the role of a stoic, supportive partner. The video featured rapid, professional cuts. It was heavily edited to remove any context or truth. Trent had clearly hired a professional public relations team to script her every tear. Morgan pleaded with the public for support, stating she only wanted to build a life free from my toxic control. She asked her viewers to share the video to expose the truth about her abusive upbringing. The recording ended with a fade to black. I locked my phone screen. Trent had just fired his best shot. The fabricated video exploded across social media platforms within mere hours. Trent's network of tech investors and influencers amplified the post, turning a private family dispute into a viral public spectacle. By nightfall, the view count surpassed 2 million. My name trended alongside horrible hashtags branding me a vindictive, abusive monster. The digital outrage quickly bled into the physical world. Just past midnight, a loud crash startled me from my sleep. I walked downstairs and checked the security monitors. A group of masked teenagers stood on my sidewalk, hurling rocks and raw eggs at my front windows. The yolks smeared across the clean glass, dripping down the brick facade I had maintained perfectly for decades. I did not call the police. I simply saved the security footage to my primary server. The next morning, Hayes arrived at my house before sunrise. He stepped carefully over the broken eggshells on the porch. He carried a thick stack of printed articles and social media comments. His usual sharp composure showed brief signs of genuine stress. Hayes dropped the papers onto my kitchen island. He read aloud the horrific threats directed at me by anonymous internet strangers. He explained that Trent's narrative was gaining dangerous momentum in the local business community. Several of my minor supply chain vendors were threatening to pause their contracts due to the negative press. Hayes aggressively advised me to issue an immediate public statement. He wanted to draft a press release defending my character and explaining the legal reality of the warehouse lease. He argued that allowing Trent to control the public narrative would cause irreparable damage to my commercial reputation. He demanded we fight back in the press immediately before the situation escalated any further. I poured Hayes a cup of black coffee and pushed it across the granite counter. I explicitly refused his advice to issue a public statement. I explained that defending myself against fabricated emotions would only make me look guilty. Arguing with a liar in public validates their lies. I absolutely refused to play the role of the defensive victim. Hayes protested, insisting that silence was currently working against us. I stopped him by raising my hand. I told him we would not fight Trent with a carefully drafted press release. We would fight him with indisputable raw reality. I unlocked my laptop and pulled up 2 highly secured video files. I instructed Hayes to forget the public relations strategy entirely. I needed him to focus strictly on digital distribution. I pointed to the first file. It contained the complete high-definition security footage I had legally obtained from the Plaza Hotel management. The camera had captured Morgan's entire wedding toast from an unobstructed angle. It recorded every single cruel word she spoke and the exact moment I handed her the deed. I pointed to the second file. It contained the crisp, audio-synced footage from my own front porch camera. It clearly documented Trent's aggressive ambush, his racist microaggressions, and Morgan's failed emotional manipulation. I commanded Hayes to prepare these 2 unedited files for immediate release. We would not add any commentary. We would not add any sad background music. We would simply upload the raw, unfiltered truth to every single platform Trent had used to attack me. Hayes watched the raw footage on my screen. His stressed expression vanished, replaced by a ruthless, predatory smile. He understood the lethal efficiency of the counterstrike. Hayes left my house with the encrypted drives ready to execute the upload sequence upon my command. I spent the remainder of the evening sitting alone in the dark confines of my home office. The only light in the room came from the glowing screen of my desktop monitor. I replayed the raw footage over and over again in complete silence. I watched Morgan disown me on the grand stage. I watched Trent scream at me on my own porch. I analyzed their body language, their arrogance, and their absolute certainty that they possessed total control over my life. They had built a massive, fragile house of cards based entirely on public perception. They required the world to view them as refined, innocent victims. I checked the digital clock on my wall. I needed to maximize the destructive impact of the release. I knew Trent's critical meeting with his primary tech investors was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. He desperately needed that capital injection to survive the impending eviction. If I released the videos now, his public relations team would have the entire night to spin a defense. They would try to block the spread or issue immediate apologies to mitigate the financial damage. I refused to give them a single second to recover. I scheduled the coordinated release for exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The raw footage would hit the internet exactly 1 hour before Trent walked into that boardroom. The truth would detonate precisely as he sat down to ask for millions of dollars. I leaned back in my leather chair and closed the laptop. The room plunged into total darkness. My timing was absolute perfection. I closed my eyes and waited patiently for the dawn. Dawn broke over the Baltimore skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across my home office. The digital clock on my desk flipped to exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. I opened my laptop and bypassed all public relations strategies. I did not write a defensive caption. I did not tag any news outlets. I simply took the two raw, unedited video files and uploaded them directly to the identical social media platforms where Morgan had posted her tearful lie. I pressed the enter key and let the truth speak entirely for itself. The first video contained the pristine high-definition audio and visual recording from the Plaza Hotel. It completely stripped away Morgan's edited narrative of a supportive daughter escaping a controlling father. The raw footage showed her standing in front of 150 high society guests holding a glass of champagne and publicly declaring her lifelong shame of my working-class existence. It captured the exact moment she threw her arms around Gregory, claiming him as her true father while I sat silently at the corner table. The second video was even more devastating. It featured the crisp security camera feed from my front porch. It showed Trent arriving uninvited, his face twisted in ugly rage. The microphone caught every single word of his legal threats and his entitled demands. It perfectly captured his racial microaggressions, his sneering references to my blue-collar background, and his explicit threats to destroy my reputation. It showed Morgan standing right behind him, dropping her fake tears the moment I refused to fund her husband's failing business. The raw files offered no background music and no emotional filters. They presented the cold, undeniable reality of their extreme arrogance and my absolute restraint. The digital bomb was officially armed and deployed. The shift in public perception occurred with violent, undeniable speed. The internet is a ruthless machine, and it absolutely hates being manipulated. Within the first 30 minutes, a prominent social media commentator discovered my raw footage and placed it side by side with Morgan's heavily edited victim video. The comparison spread like wildfire across every major platform. The millions of anonymous strangers who had hurled vicious insults at me the previous night suddenly realized they had been weaponized by a pair of wealthy, entitled frauds. The public narrative flipped instantly and entirely. The very same platforms that hosted Trent's fabricated smear campaign became the instruments of his absolute destruction. Thousands of comments flooded the videos, tearing apart Morgan's fake tears and dissecting Trent's horrific porch behavior. People analyzed Trent's body language, pointing out his aggressive posture and his blatant elitism. They highlighted the stark contrast between my quiet dignity and his unhinged, screaming tantrum. The public recognized the truth immediately. I was not a toxic, controlling father trying to ruin a marriage. I was a self-made man who simply refused to be financially exploited any longer. The digital mob turned its full aggressive attention entirely against Morgan and Trent. The hashtags that previously demanded my ruin were swiftly replaced by trending topics demanding their complete cancellation. Bloggers and journalists who had initially shared Morgan's video scrambled to delete their posts and issue retractions. They pivoted rapidly to cover the spectacular downfall of a fake tech entrepreneur and his spoiled wife. I sat in my quiet kitchen drinking my morning coffee, watching the numbers climb exponentially. The trap I set was working with absolute precision. Trent wanted a public trial, and the jury had just returned a unanimous, devastating verdict. The digital outrage did not remain confined to personal social media accounts. The aggressive mob quickly tracked down Trent's professional footprint. They targeted his heavily promoted technology startup with lethal efficiency. Trent had built his entire corporate image around being a progressive, socially conscious entrepreneur. The raw porch footage completely shattered that expensive illusion. Investors, clients, and industry peers watched him hurl elitist insults and racial microaggressions at an elderly black man. The professional fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. Trent's company pages on every business platform were immediately flooded with thousands of one-star reviews. The comment sections of his corporate promotional videos turned into a massive graveyard of public condemnation. Potential clients canceled their software subscriptions within hours. Long-term partners issued immediate public statements distancing their brands from Trent and his organization. The sheer volume of negative traffic crashed his startup's primary website. Trent had carefully planned to walk into his 9 o'clock investor meeting as a victim seeking sympathetic funding. Instead, he walked into a boardroom holding a toxic radioactive brand. The investors did not even let him open his presentation. They had already seen the trending videos. They saw the public relations nightmare unfolding in real time. They recognized the immense financial liability of associating with his destroyed reputation. Trent had confidently promised Morgan that he would crush my empire in the court of public opinion. He failed to comprehend that the court of public opinion is merciless toward wealthy hypocrites. The financial bleeding of his company accelerated to a fatal pace. I watched his corporate empire begin to burn to the ground, entirely ignited by the match he handed me. His startup was no longer just facing a commercial eviction. It was facing total, undeniable bankruptcy. My phone vibrated heavily against the granite kitchen island. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message. The sender was Morgan. The notification preview showed a massive block of frantic, desperate text. The first line was visible, begging me to answer the phone and claiming that the situation had completely spiraled out of control. The internet was ripping her marriage apart, and she needed me to delete the videos immediately. She was likely experiencing the exact same panic she had caused me when she publicly disowned me at her $40,000 wedding. She expected me to feel paternal guilt. She expected me to rescue her from the roaring fire she had gleefully started. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. I felt absolutely no anger, no sadness, and no desire to engage. The emotional bond that once compelled me to sacrifice my own happiness for her comfort had been permanently severed. She traded my protection for Gregory's wealth, and now she had to face the consequences of that brutal transaction completely alone. I picked up the phone. I did not read the rest of her frantic apology. I did not care about her excuses, her tears, or her sudden realization that Trent was a monumental liability. I pressed my thumb against the screen and deleted the entire message thread without opening it. I blocked her number permanently. I set the phone face down on the counter and returned to my coffee. The silence in my house was profound and incredibly peaceful. The public smear campaign had been neutralized and reversed. Trent's corporate shield was currently disintegrating. The preliminary phase of the adjustment was finished. It was time to execute the financial strike. The massive fallout hit Trent's startup exactly 48 hours after the video went viral. The brutal consequences materialized at 9 o'clock in the morning, right in the middle of his scheduled investor meeting. Trent had confidently assured his board that the entire public relations disaster was fully contained. He lied through his teeth, claiming his expensive crisis management team had completely neutralized the viral damage. His primary investors, a consortium of highly cautious venture capitalists, did not believe a single word of his desperate spin. They possessed eyes, internet access, and a strict aversion to toxic publicity. The lead investor, a ruthless man named Sterling, projected the unedited porch video onto the massive boardroom screen. He forced Trent to watch his own racist meltdown in high definition. Sterling systematically dismantled Trent's fabricated excuses. He pointed out the staggering loss of their premium commercial warehouse lease. He explicitly highlighted the massive public boycott currently destroying their consumer base. The investors viewed Trent as a completely unhinged liability who hurled racial slurs at his own father-in-law on a residential street. They unanimously voted to invoke the morality clause hidden deep within their funding agreement. They formally pulled their entire $10 million capital injection. The financial lifeblood of Trent's fragile startup vanished instantly. Trent attempted to beg Offering to step down as CEO and take a silent background role. Sterling rejected the offer immediately. He stated that the brand was entirely radioactive and completely unsalvageable. The investors walked out of the glass boardroom in total silence, leaving Trent completely alone in the wreckage of his own arrogant creation. The impending eviction was no longer his primary concern. His entire company was officially dead in the water. Trent stormed into his suburban home 3 hours later. His face was a terrifying mask of absolute unhinged fury. Morgan sat on their expensive velvet sofa, anxiously scrolling through the relentless barrage of negative comments on her phone. She looked up, expecting her husband to offer comfort and reassurance. Instead, Trent hurled his expensive leather briefcase violently across the living room. It smashed into a glass side table, shattering the expensive surface into 1,000 pieces. Morgan screamed and jumped to her feet. Trent pointed a shaking finger directly at her face. He blamed her completely for the entire catastrophe. He screamed that her arrogant, idiotic wedding speech had triggered my destructive retaliation. He stated that her desperate need to impress his wealthy father had cost him a $10 million investment. Morgan fired back instantly, her own entitled anger flaring up. She reminded him that he was the one caught on video screaming racial slurs on my front porch. She accused him of ruining his own reputation with his lack of self-control. Trent closed the distance between them, his voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper. He told Morgan she was nothing but a useless, spoiled liability. He admitted he only tolerated her constant whining because he desperately needed my commercial warehouse rent-free. He explicitly stated that without my financial backing, she offered absolutely zero value to his life or his company. The brutal truth hung heavily in the air between them. Morgan finally understood that her aristocratic husband viewed her entirely as a disposable financial asset. The loving, sophisticated marriage she proudly paraded at the Plaza Hotel shattered into irreparable, ugly pieces right in front of her eyes. While Trent and Morgan tore their marriage apart in the suburbs, I sat quietly in my home office. A heavy knock sounded at my front door precisely at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I opened it to find Marcus, the private investigator I had retained on Hayes's strict recommendation. Marcus did not offer small talk. He walked straight into my office and placed a thick manila envelope directly onto my desk. I opened the flap and pulled out a stack of high-resolution surveillance photographs and dense financial printouts. Marcus explained that he had successfully traced the digital footprints of Trent's failing startup. The photographs showed Trent having discreet meetings with known offshore financial fixers in dark, expensive restaurants. The financial printouts documented a series of massive, highly suspicious wire transfers. Over the past 6 months, Trent had systematically siphoned nearly $500,000 out of his company's operational accounts. He funneled the stolen capital through a complex web of shell corporations directly into a personal, untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He was actively embezzling funds while simultaneously begging investors for more money. Marcus pointed out that Trent executed the final largest transfer just hours after the investors pulled their funding that morning. Trent knew his startup was dead. He was actively looting the remaining corpse before the bankruptcy courts could freeze the accounts. I examined the precise dates on the wire transfers. Trent had planned this exit strategy long before my eviction notice forced his hand. He was a highly calculated professional thief preparing to run. I placed the damning financial records carefully back onto my heavy oak desk. The initial scope of the investigation clearly needed rapid expansion. Trent's systematic embezzlement of company funds indicated a deeply ingrained pattern of sophisticated criminal behavior. This was not his first financial crime. I looked directly at Marcus. I instructed him to completely bypass the current startup accounts and dig aggressively into Trent's personal financial history. I wanted a comprehensive audit of every single loan credit line and business transaction Trent had touched over the last 5 years. I suspected he was hiding a much darker financial secret beneath his polished, aristocratic exterior. I specifically ordered Marcus to scrutinize Trent's joint accounts with Morgan. If Trent was ruthlessly stealing from his own corporate investors, he was undoubtedly exploiting his own wife's financial standing. I authorized Marcus to utilize unlimited funds to accelerate the investigation. I needed absolute proof of every single fraudulent act before I launched my final decisive strike. I knew Morgan would soon arrive at my doorstep, broken and desperate, seeking financial salvation from the father she publicly disowned. I intended to hand her the exact truth she desperately avoided. I wanted the complete financial dossier ready and waiting for her inevitable tearful return. Marcus nodded silently, gathered his notes, and quickly left my house. I remained alone in my quiet office. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee. The traps were fully set. The execution required only a brief period of patient waiting. I drank my coffee and watched the afternoon shadows lengthen across the room. The afternoon shadows had barely stretched across the manicured lawn when a generic rideshare vehicle idled at the curb. I watched through the large front window as Morgan stepped out alone. She did not arrive in Trent's gleaming luxury SUV. She walked slowly up the concrete driveway, her posture entirely defeated. The expensive designer clothes she wore looked severely wrinkled and hastily thrown on. Her face was bare of makeup, her eyes swollen and flushed red from hours of intense crying. She reached the porch and knocked softly, a hesitant, rhythmic tap that painfully reminded me of how she used to knock on my workshop door when she was a little girl seeking comfort after scraping her knee. I unbolted the heavy, solid wood door and pulled it open. She stood on the threshold, shivering despite the mild afternoon weather. The fake, calculated tears she had weaponized just days ago for the internet were completely gone. These tears were raw, born of genuine fear and a rapidly collapsing reality. Her aristocratic husband had turned his unfiltered, vicious rage onto her. She looked up at me, her shoulders trembling violently, and whispered a desperate apology. She admitted that Trent had completely lost his mind, screaming that she was a worthless liability without my money backing them. The sophisticated high society marriage she had proudly flaunted at the Plaza Hotel had disintegrated in record time. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, stepping inside my home the exact moment I stepped back to allow her entry. She looked entirely broken, stripped of the arrogant superiority she had worn like a crown during her wedding reception. The illusion of her perfect new life had vanished, leaving only a terrified woman realizing she had married a monster. She followed me silently into the kitchen, dragging her feet heavily across the hardwood floor. Morgan collapsed into one of the heavy oak chairs at the kitchen island like a marionette with cut strings. She immediately launched into a frantic, breathless monologue. She detailed the horrific, glass-shattering argument with Trent, describing how he blamed her entirely for the catastrophic loss of his investors. She painted herself as the ultimate victim of circumstance, completely glossing over her own cruel speech at the wedding and her subsequent participation in the online smear campaign. She reached across the cold granite counter, desperately trying to grab my calloused hand for reassurance. I pulled my hand away slowly and deliberately, resting it flat on the stone surface out of her reach. Morgan ignored the silent rejection and plowed forward with her true agenda. She insisted that Trent was simply acting out under immense pressure because of the hostile business environment. She claimed that if I just wrote a temporary bridge loan to save his startup from eviction and bankruptcy, the stress would evaporate and her marriage would return to normal. She expected the familiar dynamic to play out exactly as it always had since her teenage years. She assumed my ingrained paternal instinct would completely override my logic and self-respect. She waited for me to sigh, offer a comforting platitude about family, and pull out my checkbook to permanently shield her from the consequences of her choices. I offered her absolutely nothing but profound, heavy silence. I stared directly into her tear-filled eyes without blinking. I did not nod in sympathy. I did not utter a single word of forgiveness or reassurance. The absolute void of my reaction unnerved her completely. Her frantic rambling slowed, then sputtered to a complete halt. She wiped her wet cheeks with the back of her hand, looking at me as if I were a terrifying stranger. The endless well of my financial rescue had run completely dry, and she was terrified to finally see the empty bottom. I stood up from my stool and walked down the hall to my home office without breaking eye contact. I retrieved the thick manila envelope Marcus, the private investigator, had delivered just hours prior. I returned to the kitchen and dropped the heavy package onto the granite island. The loud, definitive slap of the paper hitting the stone echoed sharply through the quiet room, causing Morgan to flinch visibly. I placed my fingertips firmly on the envelope and slid it slowly across the counter until it rested directly in front of her folded hands. I broke my silence with a voice completely devoid of anger, malice, or warmth. I told her that she did not need a bridge loan to save a struggling technology company. I stated clearly that she needed to understand exactly who she had married before she dared to ask me for a single dime. I explained that I had hired a top-tier financial investigator to examine the structural integrity of Trent's failing business and his personal background. I warned her that the elegant fairy tale she believed she was living was actually a highly orchestrated, malicious financial crime. I instructed her to stop crying, open her eyes, and start reading the undeniable proof. Morgan stared at the unmarked envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She hesitated, her hands hovering nervously above the paper. She was terrified of whatever truth was contained inside that folder. She desperately preferred the comfortable lie of a stressed, overworked husband over the harsh reality of a calculated thief. I did not pressure her to open it. I simply stood across the island, maintaining my cold, unwavering gaze. I told her that she could either look at the evidence and face the reality of her choices, or she could walk right back out my front door and continue living in a beautiful, collapsing delusion. Morgan reached out with trembling fingers and flipped open the metal clasp of the manila envelope. She pulled out the dense stack of high-resolution surveillance photographs and heavily highlighted financial records. She spread them out across the kitchen island, her eyes darting frantically across the printed spreadsheets. The frantic, self-pitying tears completely stopped flowing down her cheeks. Her breathing hitched sharply in her throat. She stared at the clear photographs of her husband sitting in dark restaurant booths with known offshore financial fixers. I watched her trace her manicured finger over the highlighted routing numbers. She saw the exact dates and the massive sums of capital Trent had systematically siphoned out of his startup's operational accounts. I pointed a steady finger to the final page in the stack. I explained that Trent had not just stolen from his corporate investors to line his own pockets. Marcus had uncovered the deeply buried truth regarding her own personal finances. The documents clearly showed that Trent had secretly leveraged their marital home and completely drained their joint savings accounts to funnel the cash into his personal, untraceable offshore haven in the Cayman Islands. Morgan's face turned a sickly chalk white. Absolute, unadulterated horror completely replaced her previous sorrow. She realized that Trent was never stressed about saving his tech company. He was aggressively looting the sinking ship and actively planning to abandon her in the wreckage. He had forged her signature on multiple credit applications to maximize his criminal haul before fleeing the country. She was not just trapped in a failing marriage. She was legally tethered to a massive federal fraud that would inevitably destroy her life. The sheer scale of his betrayal crushed the final remnants of her aristocratic illusion. Morgan looked up from the documents, her eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. She finally understood that her high society husband was a ruthless, calculated predator. Morgan's eyes locked onto a heavily stapled commercial loan agreement near the bottom of the stack. The official logo of a massive national private lending firm sat at the top of the page. She pulled the document closer, her manicured finger tracing the thick black ink of the signature line. Her own name was signed perfectly in blue ink on the line designating the primary financial guarantor. She stared at the loops and curves of the handwriting for a long moment, completely paralyzed by the implication. She stated in a hollow, terrified whisper that she had never seen this document in her entire life. The principal amount listed on the front page was exactly $500,000. I leaned across the granite island and pointed to the official notary stamp positioned directly beside her forged signature. Trent had not just copied her handwriting. He had utilized a corrupt contact within his own corporate network to illegally notarize the fraudulent document, bypassing all security checks. The specific dates on the loan application perfectly aligned with the exact week they returned from their luxury honeymoon in the Maldives. Trent had secured an enormous line of corporate credit by pledging Morgan's future inheritance and her pristine personal credit score as the absolute guarantee. He deliberately avoided the standard banking protocols by feeding the paperwork through a ruthless private lending firm that prioritized aggressive interest rates over strict verification. Morgan stood frozen as the sheer magnitude of the financial trap closed tightly around her throat. She had unknowingly assumed $500,000 of toxic commercial debt. Trent had transformed his new wife into an expendable human shield to absorb the inevitable blast radius of his failing technology startup. I did not allow the devastating reality to settle before delivering the final crushing blow. I instructed Morgan to look at the date of the first missed vendor payment buried deep within the corporate ledger Marcus had provided. The failure to pay basic operational expenses began 9 full months ago. Trent's highly polished technology startup was functionally bankrupt long before he ever walked down the aisle at the Plaza Hotel. He possessed zero actual revenue and absolutely no viable product to sell to the market. He was running a sophisticated corporate mirage fueled entirely by stolen investor capital. I explained that an elite entrepreneur from a supposedly wealthy family does not marry the daughter of a blue-collar mechanic out of pure unconditional love. He specifically targeted her because he desperately required my commercial warehouse rent-free to maintain his facade of immense success. The sleek glass walls, the custom servers, and the fancy espresso machines he installed were financed entirely by the money he actively embezzled from his own board of directors. Trent needed a wealthy father-in-law to absorb his crushing overhead costs and keep the illusion alive. When I presented the ironclad family trust lease explicitly barring his company from operating on my property, his entire survival strategy collapsed instantly. He realized he could not legally extract my assets through a standard marriage arrangement. He married Morgan solely to secure a temporary geographical headquarters and a naive financial guarantor. The lavish wedding reception, the expensive catering, and the high society guest list were nothing but a calculated business expense to secure his human shield. Morgan was never his beloved wife. She was a strategic corporate acquisition designed specifically to be liquidated the absolute moment his fraudulent empire caught fire. Morgan shook her head rapidly from side to side. She backed away from the kitchen island, clutching her arms tightly against her chest as her breathing accelerated into a heavy panic. She raised her voice, screaming that the documents had to be completely fabricated. She accused me of forging the banking records just to sabotage her marriage and punish her for the cruel wedding speech she had delivered. Her mind violently rejected the truth, desperately clinging to the elegant illusion Trent had spent the last 2 years carefully constructing. She pulled her smartphone from her designer handbag with shaking, frantic hands. She declared she would call Trent right now to clear up this massive misunderstanding. She insisted he would provide a perfectly logical explanation for the offshore accounts, the forged signature, and the missing capital. She tapped his contact name and raised the phone to her ear, pacing heavily across the hardwood floor. The speaker echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. The line rang exactly one time before a sharp mechanical click cut the connection. Trent forwarded her incoming call directly to his automated voicemail. Morgan pulled the phone away from her face, staring at the screen in pure shock. She immediately dialed the number a second time, her thumb hitting the glass with frantic force. The exact same mechanical click echoed through the room, followed immediately by the sterile voice of his automated greeting. He was actively watching her call and actively rejecting her. He knew the investors had pulled their funding. He knew the financial authorities would inevitably trace the missing capital. He was currently executing his pre-planned exit strategy, and cutting all communication with his disposable wife was the critical first step. Morgan lowered the phone slowly, the final shred of her denial completely shattering into dust. I stepped away from the kitchen counter and looked at my daughter with absolute unyielding clarity. I informed her that Trent's cowardice was not her most urgent problem. I pointed directly at the $500,000 loan agreement resting on the granite island. The private lending firm would not care that Trent forged her signature. They would not care that her husband abandoned her while fleeing the country with stolen funds. The document was legally notarized and securely filed in the corporate registry. The exact moment Trent defaulted on the primary payments, the massive collection agencies would instantly target the designated guarantor. I stated clearly that she was now legally responsible for $500,000 of toxic corporate debt. The collection lawyers would aggressively seize her personal bank accounts, liquidate her luxury vehicles, and place massive liens against any future income she ever generated. This financial anchor would permanently destroy her credit score and eradicate any chance she had of returning to the elite social circles she so desperately craved. I reminded her that my lawyers had specifically structured my estate to be entirely shielded from her external liabilities. Trent could not access my wealth, and neither could his ruthless creditors. She would face the brutal, crushing weight of commercial bankruptcy entirely on her own. The sophisticated high society life she chose over her own family had effectively ended. Morgan dropped her smartphone onto the kitchen floor. The device cracked loudly against the hardwood. She let out a horrific, guttural scream of absolute panic. She spun around and sprinted frantically down the hallway toward the front door. She threw her weight against the heavy wood, pulling it open with terrifying desperation. She ran blindly down the concrete driveway toward the street, fleeing from a catastrophic reality she could no longer escape. I stood perfectly still in my kitchen, listening to the heavy front door slam shut. Morgan gripped the leather steering wheel of her luxury sedan so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. She sped through the quiet suburban streets, her foot pressing heavily on the accelerator, desperate to outrun the crushing weight of a $500,000 forged loan. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. The terrifying reality of Trent's absolute betrayal replayed on an endless loop in her mind. She had been used, manipulated, and discarded by the man who promised her an elite high society existence. She turned her vehicle onto the sweeping manicured highway leading toward the wealthiest district in the state. She was driving directly toward the massive gated estate belonging to Gregory. He was Trent's father. He was the man she had publicly embraced and tearfully declared her true father in front of 150 wedding guests. She convinced herself that Gregory would protect her. She believed his immense wealth and formidable influence could easily absorb a mere $500,000. She rationalized that Gregory would be equally horrified by Trent's criminal embezzlement and would immediately deploy his elite corporate lawyers to shield his beloved daughter-in-law from absolute financial ruin. Morgan arrived at the towering wrought iron security gates guarding the sprawling property. She frantically pressed the brass intercom button, identifying herself to the private security staff with a voice cracking from panic. The heavy metal gates slowly swung open, granting her access to the immaculate winding driveway lined with imported oak trees. She parked her car haphazardly behind a row of polished imported vehicles, completely ignoring the designated spaces. She practically fell out of the driver's seat, sprinting up the wide stone steps toward the imposing double doors of the mansion. She believed she was running toward salvation. The heavy mahogany door opened before Morgan could even raise her fist to knock. Gregory stood perfectly framed in the doorway, wearing a pristine, tailored suit and holding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He did not step aside to welcome her into his opulent foyer. He blocked the entrance entirely, his posture rigid and his expression completely devoid of the warm paternal affection he had displayed at the wedding reception. Morgan immediately launched into a frantic, sobbing explanation. She detailed the forged loan documents, the secret offshore accounts, and Trent's sudden disappearance. She begged him for emergency legal protection and financial rescue. Gregory took a slow, deliberate sip from his glass, watching her cry with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an insect. He did not offer a comforting embrace or a single word of reassurance. He waited for her panicked rambling to exhaust itself. Gregory finally spoke, his voice dropping the polite aristocratic charm he usually weaponized in public. He informed Morgan that Trent's commercial liabilities were strictly a marital issue. He explicitly stated that her signature on those private lending contracts legally bound her and only her to the $500,000 debt. Morgan stared at him in absolute shock, her hands trembling violently. She reminded him that she was his family now, the daughter he had proudly welcomed into his elite lineage just weeks prior. Gregory offered a dry, humorless smile. He clarified that his vast estate and his personal assets were entirely insulated by ironclad legal trusts. He told her plainly that he would not authorize a single dollar of his personal wealth to cover the reckless, fraudulent debts generated by his son. He made it crystal clear that her financial destruction was entirely her own problem to solve. Morgan gasped, stepping back as if she had been physically struck by his words. She pleaded with him, asking how he could be so exceptionally cruel to a woman he had called his own flesh and blood. Gregory laughed, a harsh, grating sound that completely shattered the quiet afternoon air. He dropped every remaining ounce of high society pretense. He looked Morgan up and down with unfiltered, visceral disgust. He informed her that he never viewed her as a daughter. He explicitly stated that she was nothing more than a temporary strategic acquisition for Trent's failing technology startup. Gregory explained that he had thoroughly researched my financial background before allowing Trent to propose. He knew I owned the highly valuable commercial warehouse entirely debt-free. He assumed I was a naive, uneducated blue-collar laborer who could be easily manipulated into surrendering my assets to a polished, wealthy family. He tolerated Morgan's presence, her lack of pedigree, and her endless social climbing solely because she was the direct key to unlocking my hidden wealth. Gregory stepped closer to the threshold, his voice turning lethally sharp. He stated that the exact moment I legally barricaded the warehouse and suspended my financial support, Morgan lost her entire utility. He called her a foolish, working-class liability who mistakenly believed she could seamlessly assimilate into a world of generational wealth. He mocked her tearful wedding speech, pointing out the absolute absurdity of a girl abandoning a father who financed her entire existence for a family that actively planned to liquidate her. He stripped away her entire identity, confirming that his elite circle viewed her entirely as a disposable pawn in a corporate transaction. She was absolutely worthless to them the second she stopped being profitable. Morgan opened her mouth to argue, but her vocal cords completely failed. The brutal, suffocating truth paralyzed her entirely. She had deliberately alienated the only man who truly loved her without conditions. She had traded my decades of quiet, relentless sacrifice for an empty promise of unearned status. She had desperately sought validation from a man who considered her absolute garbage. Gregory did not wait for a response. He looked at her tear-stained face with supreme, icy indifference. He instructed her to leave his property immediately before he instructed his private security detail to forcibly remove her for trespassing. He turned his back on her, completely dismissing her existence. The massive mahogany door swung shut with a thunderous final slam that vibrated through the heavy stone porch. The loud click of the deadbolt locking into place echoed across the manicured estate. Morgan stood entirely alone on the expansive, immaculate steps. The luxurious world she had sacrificed her soul to enter had officially locked her out forever. She slowly turned around and stared at the empty, manicured driveway. She had absolutely nothing left. Her husband was an international fugitive who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her new family viewed her as a failed financial investment. She carried a $500,000 fraudulent debt that would inevitably seize her cars, empty her remaining bank accounts, and destroy her future. She sank to her knees on the cold stone, wrapping her arms around herself as violent sobs finally broke through her chest. The fairy tale was permanently over. She finally realized the staggering magnitude of her catastrophic miscalculation. She had traded a fiercely protective father for a pack of starving wolves, and they had just finished picking her bones completely clean. The crisp morning air carried the sharp scent of industrial exhaust and impending finality. Day 30 arrived exactly as the legal calendar mandated. I parked my heavy work truck across the street from the sprawling commercial warehouse I had purchased 3 decades ago. The rising sun glinted off the cheap, trendy glass facade Trent had installed over my solid brick foundation. Hayes sat in the passenger seat beside me, nursing a black coffee in a cardboard cup. He checked his platinum wristwatch with the clinical precision of an executioner awaiting the precise moment to pull the lever. The warehouse parking lot was eerily quiet. A few dedicated employees arrived early, clutching their briefcases and swiping their key cards at the main entrance. They possessed zero knowledge of the catastrophic reality about to descend upon their workplace. Trent had undoubtedly lied to his staff just as easily as he had lied to his investors and my daughter. He likely spun a desperate narrative of a temporary cash flow issue hiding the absolute bankruptcy that was consuming his entire operation. I watched a young intern unlock the front door, oblivious to the fact that her employment was effectively terminated. Hayes broke the morning silence, stating that the local precinct had confirmed the dispatch of their tactical eviction unit. He reminded me that the specific terms of our commercial lease required zero physical intervention on my part. The state possessed the legal authority to reclaim my property forcefully. I kept my eyes fixed on the massive steel loading bay doors. Those doors represented years of my grueling night shifts at the shipyard. I had bled to own this dirt, and Trent had foolishly believed he could steal it with forged signatures and arrogant entitlement. The grace period was officially over. A convoy of 3 heavily armored county sheriff cruisers turned onto the industrial block with their emergency lights flashing a blinding pattern of red and blue. They did not activate their sirens. The flashing lights painted the cold asphalt with undeniable authority. The vehicles stopped directly in front of the primary glass entrance of Trent's failing startup. 5 uniformed officers stepped out simultaneously, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect synchronization. The lead deputy carried a massive pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters and thick coils of industrial steel chain draped over his shoulder. The operation was swift, methodical, and entirely legally binding. 2 deputies flanked the main entrance while the lead officer marched directly inside the lobby. I watched through the clear glass walls as the early arriving employees froze in absolute terror. The deputy produced a highly visible court order demanding the immediate evacuation of the premises. Panic erupted inside the building. Workers scrambled to gather their personal belongings, dropping files and coffee cups in their frantic rush to exit the building. The deputies guided the bewildered staff out through the front doors, ensuring the massive commercial space was completely cleared of all human presence. Trent's lavishly decorated lobby emptied out into the chilly morning air. The lead sheriff stepped back outside and pulled the heavy glass doors completely shut. He wrapped the thick industrial steel chains around the customized silver handles Trent had imported from Italy. The sharp mechanical snap of the heavy brass padlock echoed across the empty street. The warehouse was officially secured and legally reclaimed. Every custom computer server, every piece of expensive office furniture, and every single digital asset remaining inside now belonged entirely to me, to liquidate against Trent's massive unpaid rent. A screech of burning rubber shattered the tense atmosphere as Trent's luxury Mercedes careened around the corner. He slammed the brakes, skidding violently into the red zone directly behind the parked police cruisers. He leaped out of the driver's seat before the vehicle had even completely stopped rocking. He wore a wrinkled designer suit, his hair completely disheveled, entirely stripped of his usual polished arrogance. The reality of his absolute destruction had finally caught up to his desperate offshore maneuvering. Trent stared at the thick steel chains wrapped around his corporate headquarters and completely lost his mind. He sprinted toward the main entrance, screaming a frantic barrage of profanities and demanding immediate access to his servers. The lead deputy stepped forward, raising a firm hand and ordering him to stand down. Trent ignored the lawful command entirely. He hurled himself forward, shouting wildly about his fundamental rights and his fabricated legal ownership. Blinded by the catastrophic loss of his stolen empire, he made the ultimate fatal miscalculation. Trent shoved his hands violently against the chest of the lead sheriff, attempting to physically overpower a sworn officer of the law. The response was instantaneous and brutally effective. 2 adjacent deputies surged forward, grabbing Trent by the shoulders and sweeping his legs out from underneath him. Trent crashed face first onto the hard concrete sidewalk with a sickening thud. The deputies drove their knees deeply into his back, pinning him firmly to the pavement. They grabbed his flailing arms, wrenching them aggressively behind his back. The sharp metallic click of police handcuffs snapping tightly around Trent's wrists finalized his absolute downfall. His screaming degenerated into pathetic, high-pitched sobbing as he writhed helplessly against the cold concrete. The deputies hauled Trent violently to his feet, ignoring his pathetic whimpering and scraped, bleeding face. They dragged the former tech CEO across the parking lot like a common street criminal. The elegant facade he had weaponized to manipulate my daughter and steal my resources was completely gone. He was nothing more than a ruined, desperate fraud facing massive federal embezzlement charges and the immediate reality of state prison. The officers forced Trent to bend over, shoving his head down as they threw him roughly into the cramped back seat of the nearest police cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut, trapping him entirely within a cage of his own making. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his terrified, tear-stained face pressing against the reinforced glass window. I rolled down the window of my work truck, letting the crisp morning air fill the cabin. The lead sheriff stood on the sidewalk, dusting off his uniform and adjusting his utility belt. He looked across the street and locked eyes with me. He recognized the man who had filed the exhaustive, airtight paperwork that authorized this perfectly executed morning raid. I did not smile. I did not show an ounce of malicious joy. I offered the officer a single slow nod of profound respect and deep gratitude. The sheriff returned the nod, silently acknowledging the successful completion of a highly volatile assignment. I rolled the window back up, sealing off the noise of the sirens and the chaotic aftermath of Trent's destruction. Hayes closed his briefcase, his posture reflecting absolute professional satisfaction. I shifted the truck into drive and pulled smoothly away from the curb. I left the massive brick warehouse behind me, completely satisfied that the long, silent adjustment was finally complete. Trent sat shivering on the cold, stainless steel bench of the county holding cell. The severe reality of his arrest had completely stripped away his polished aristocratic facade. The heavy steel door locked him inside a bleak, windowless room, but his mind raced furiously, calculating his remaining options. He knew the state prosecutors were currently building a massive case for commercial fraud, but the federal authorities had not yet frozen his secondary offshore accounts. He possessed a narrow, rapidly closing window of opportunity to escape. Trent utilized his single allowed phone call to contact a highly connected, ruthless criminal defense attorney who specialized in high-flight risk clients. He did not ask for a trial strategy. He demanded immediate bail. The attorney required an exorbitant retainer and the full bail amount transferred instantly. Trent provided the encrypted routing numbers to his hidden Cayman Islands accounts, actively draining the absolute last of the stolen company funds he had siphoned from his investors. He liquidated his entire financial safety net just to purchase a few hours of unmonitored freedom. The transaction cleared the international wire protocols just before the federal banking freeze officially took effect. The heavy steel door of the holding cell finally clicked open. The guard handed Trent his personal effects in a clear plastic bag. Trent walked out of the precinct into the harsh glare of the late afternoon sun. He possessed no company, no investors, and his reputation was completely annihilated. His luxury Mercedes was currently impounded in a police lot. He hailed a passing taxi, sliding into the back seat with a dark, venomous determination. He needed untraceable physical assets to completely disappear across the border, and he knew exactly where to find them. He gave the driver the address to the suburban home he shared with his wife. Trent ordered the taxi to park 2 blocks away from his sprawling suburban residence. He walked the remaining distance through the quiet neighborhood, keeping to the lengthening shadows to avoid the security cameras mounted on neighboring houses. He slipped through the wooden side gate and used his key to unlock the heavy back patio door. He moved through the silent house with the practiced stealth of a professional burglar. He knew Morgan was currently weeping in the downstairs living room, entirely consumed by her own financial panic. Trent bypassed the ground floor entirely and crept silently up the carpeted stairs to their master suite. He walked directly to the hidden wall safe concealed behind a large framed mirror. He punched in the security code, his fingers moving rapidly over the digital keypad. The heavy steel door swung open. Trent ruthlessly emptied the contents into a black canvas duffel bag. He grabbed Morgan's flawless diamond wedding ring, the matching platinum bands, and every single piece of heirloom jewelry she had inherited from her late grandmother. He completely ignored the sentimental value of the velvet boxes, viewing them purely as liquid assets he could easily fence for untraceable cash. He rummaged aggressively through her polished mahogany desk drawers, tossing aside personal letters until he found exactly what he was looking for. He pulled out the pristine physical title to Morgan's luxury sedan. The vehicle was paid off, making it incredibly easy to sell to a discreet black market broker he knew in the city. Trent zipped the heavy duffel bag shut, slinging it over his shoulder. He did not leave a note. He did not feel a single ounce of remorse for leaving his wife entirely destitute. He slipped back out the patio door, vanishing into the neighborhood like a ghost. Morgan dragged herself up the grand staircase 2 hours later, her body physically exhausted from the relentless, suffocating panic attacks. She sought the quiet sanctuary of her master bedroom, desperately needing to lie down and process the catastrophic ruin of her life. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and immediately froze. The large framed mirror hung crookedly on its hinges. The solid steel door of the wall safe stood wide open, exposing the dark, completely empty interior. Morgan dropped her phone onto the plush carpet and sprinted across the room. She dropped to her knees, frantically sweeping her hands through the empty safe. Her grandmother's vintage pearls were gone. Her expensive diamond earrings had vanished. Her custom platinum wedding ring, the ultimate symbol of her supposed high society triumph, was completely missing. She scrambled over to her mahogany desk and pulled the drawers violently open. The file folders were scattered across the floor, and the physical title to her luxury sedan was conspicuously absent. The absolute horror of the situation crashed down upon her chest, stealing the breath directly from her lungs. Trent had bypassed the police, returned to their shared home, and systematically robbed her blind. He had stripped her of her final remaining assets while she wept downstairs. The terrifying realization solidified in her mind. Trent was not preparing a legal defense. He was gathering untraceable liquid capital to flee the jurisdiction entirely. He intended to vanish across international borders, leaving her legally anchored to a $500,000 forged commercial loan. The collection agencies and federal investigators would inevitably tear her life apart, while he lived comfortably in a non-extradition country. She was completely trapped, isolated, and financially decimated. The wolves had not just picked her bones clean, they had stolen the marrow. Morgan lunged for her dropped smartphone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. She completely abandoned her deeply ingrained aristocratic pride and her stubborn resentment. She tapped my contact name and pressed the phone against her ear, listening to the agonizingly slow ringing. I answered the call on the second ring, offering a cold, steady silence. Morgan broke instantly, her voice a hysterical, sobbing shriek. She screamed that Trent had made bail and broken into the house. She frantically listed the stolen heirloom jewelry, the missing wedding ring, and the vanished vehicle title. She begged me to call the authorities, pleading for me to deploy my resources to stop him before he boarded an international flight. She promised she would do absolutely anything if I just saved her from the crushing weight of the forged commercial debt. I listened to her desperate bargaining without interrupting. I waited for her frantic breathing to slow before delivering my response. I informed her that I did not need to call the authorities because I was already managing the situation. I explained that Marcus, my private investigator, had securely monitored Trent's encrypted phone calls from the holding cell. We knew exactly which bail bondsman he utilized and exactly which black market fence he intended to visit to liquidate her jewelry. I stated perfectly clearly that Trent was currently walking directly into a fully coordinated federal trap at the private aviation terminal. I told Morgan that I had already secured the perimeter and neutralized his escape route long before she even noticed her safe was empty. I was not reacting to her panic. I was actively orchestrating the final phase of his destruction. I instructed her to remain exactly where she was and hung up the phone. Trent paid the cab driver with a crumpled $100 bill and did not wait for the change. He stepped onto the crowded curb of the international terminal, pulling the collar of his jacket up against the evening chill. The heavy black canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder contained the absolute sum of his newly liquidated assets. The black market fence had operated exactly as promised, converting Morgan's heirloom jewelry and the luxury vehicle title into a highly portable, untraceable digital wallet stored on a secure flash drive. Trent walked through the sliding glass doors into the brightly lit concourse with a confident, predatory stride. He navigated the chaotic sea of travelers with the arrogant ease of a man who believed he was untouchable. He glanced up at the massive digital departure board, his eyes quickly finding his designated flight, first class to Geneva, Switzerland. The non-extradition haven would provide the perfect environment to reconstruct his wealth using the capital he had successfully siphoned from his corporate investors. He felt a profound sense of superiority washing over his initial panic. His startup had collapsed and his father had completely disowned him, but he had successfully outmaneuvered everyone. He had left his naive wife anchored to $500,000 of fraudulent commercial debt, effectively using her as a sacrificial decoy to stall the inevitable financial investigations. The collection agencies would descend upon Morgan, tearing her aristocratic illusions to shreds while he sipped expensive champagne cruising at 30,000 feet. He bypassed the lengthy economy lines and stepped directly onto the plush carpet of the priority check-in lane. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out his pristine passport alongside the printed one-way ticket. He was exactly 10 minutes away from clearing airport security and vanishing from the jurisdiction forever. Trent approached the premium ticketing desk and flashed a highly practiced, charming smile at the airline agent. He placed his passport flat on the polished counter, projecting absolute calm. The agent took the document, opened it to the photo page, and scanned it through the digital reader. Trent tapped his fingers rhythmically against the edge of the desk, anticipating the swift printing of his boarding pass. The agent stared at her computer monitor, her polite smile instantly vanishing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She did not hand the passport back. Trent felt a sharp, sudden spike of adrenaline pierce his chest. He opened his mouth to demand his documents, but the words never materialized. A heavy, unyielding hand clamped down viciously onto his right shoulder. A second hand gripped his left wrist with bone-crushing force. Trent spun around his heart, hammering wildly against his ribs. 4 men wearing dark windbreakers and serious expressions had completely surrounded him, effectively cutting off every possible avenue of escape. They did not look like local airport security. They were plainclothes federal marshals. The lead agent flashed a gold badge and stated Trent's full legal name with chilling authority. He informed Trent that he was not boarding a flight to Geneva or anywhere else. The agent explicitly cited multiple active federal warrants for interstate wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and flight to avoid prosecution. The trap had been set flawlessly. Marcus, the private investigator, had not merely compiled a dossier for personal leverage. At my strict directive, Marcus had forwarded the entire catalog of forged commercial loan documents and offshore wire transfers directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. The federal authorities possessed absolute proof of his fraud long before he ever stepped out of the taxi. Trent's aristocratic facade completely shattered right in the middle of the crowded international terminal. He thrashed violently against the grip of the federal marshals, screaming that they were making a catastrophic mistake. He demanded his phone, threatening to call his elite corporate lawyers and ruin their careers. The marshals ignored his frantic, high-pitched threats entirely. The lead agent kicked Trent's legs apart forcefully, driving him forward against the ticketing counter. They wrenched his arms aggressively behind his back. The heavy canvas duffel bag containing his stolen digital wealth slipped from his shoulder and crashed onto the polished floor. The airline agent stepped back in visible shock as the marshals officially read Trent his Miranda rights. His frantic resistance degenerated into absolute panic. They hauled him away from the desk, marching him roughly toward the main terminal exit. The dense crowd of travelers parted instantly, watching the former tech CEO being dragged away like a common criminal. Trent twisted his neck frantically, scanning the sea of faces in a desperate search for a way out. His eyes darted across the concourse and abruptly locked onto a solitary figure standing completely still near the sliding glass doors. I stood positioned beside a massive concrete pillar, my hands resting casually in my jacket pockets. I did not move. I did not offer a victorious smile or a dramatic gesture. I simply stared directly into his terrified, wide eyes. The realization hit Trent with the force of a freight train. He finally understood that he had never outsmarted anyone. He realized that I had orchestrated his capture with absolute precision, utilizing his own predictable greed to march him directly into a federal prison sentence. The sheer magnitude of my silent, devastating checkmate crushed his spirit completely. Trent stopped struggling against the federal marshals. His knees buckled slightly as the absolute finality of his situation settled over him. He was a ruined, penniless fraud facing decades of federal incarceration. He stared at me through the bustling crowd, his face pale and completely devoid of arrogance. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to hurl one final desperate insult, but the marshal shoved him forward before he could utter a single sound. The sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed clearly over the ambient noise of the terminal. That distinct sound signaled the absolute end of his destructive reign. I watched without blinking as the agents marched him through the automatic doors and shoved him roughly into the back of a waiting unmarked federal vehicle. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing him inside. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging into the heavy airport traffic and disappearing into the night. I remained standing by the concrete pillar for a long moment, feeling the cool evening breeze drift through the open terminal doors. The immediate physical threat to my daughter was completely neutralized. Trent would no longer siphon my resources, and he would never again use my family as a human shield for his criminal enterprises. I turned my back on the empty curb and walked steadily toward the short-term parking garage. The execution of the trap had been flawless, but the overarching war was far from over. Trent was locked in a federal cage, but the $500,000 forged commercial loan still loomed over Morgan's future like a guillotine. The structural damage he left behind required immediate attention. I unlocked my truck, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition, preparing to confront the massive financial wreckage waiting back in the suburbs. 3 months evaporated into a grueling sequence of legal depositions and federal indictments. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open to reveal a gallery packed shoulder to shoulder with local journalists, former investors, and curious onlookers hungry for high society ruin. I took my seat in the front row, wearing a tailored charcoal suit projecting absolute unyielding calm. The air in the room felt thick, buzzing with the electric anticipation of a high-stakes corporate fraud trial. Trent was escorted into the room through a side door by 2 armed bailiffs. The immaculate designer suits he once wore like armor were replaced by a standard, ill-fitting beige prison uniform. His wrists were free of handcuffs for the proceedings, but his posture lacked entirely the aristocratic arrogance that used to define him. He sat beside his expensive, sharply dressed defense attorney, a man purchased with the absolute last remnants of Trent's liquidated family favors. The presiding federal judge called the courtroom to order, the sharp crack of the wooden gavel slicing through the ambient murmurs. The federal prosecutor formally read the extensive list of charges detailing the massive commercial embezzlement, the interstate wire fraud, and the malicious forgery of the $500,000 loan agreement. The judge peered down from the elevated bench, asking the defendant for his official plea. Trent stood up, his jaw set in a rigid line of desperate defiance. He looked directly at the judge and loudly entered a plea of not guilty to all counts. He immediately launched into a frantic, unprompted justification before his lawyer could silence him. Trent boldly claimed that the forged signature was a completely manufactured accusation. He stated on the federal record that Morgan had given him full explicit verbal authorization to sign the commercial lending documents on her behalf to save their joint enterprise. He was actively attempting to drag his terrified wife down into the federal prison system with him to save his own skin. Trent's defense attorney immediately took control of the narrative, stepping away from the defendant's table to address the jury directly. He was a theatrical, highly aggressive litigator who understood that saving Trent required painting someone else as the ultimate villain. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at me, pivoting the entire focus of the courtroom toward the front row. He began to weave a complex, entirely fabricated narrative designed to manipulate the jury's perception of the events. The attorney described me not as a protective father, but as a deeply vindictive, working-class mastermind who harbored a vicious resentment against the elite social circles my daughter had married into. He claimed I had deliberately offered the commercial warehouse lease as a calculated trap, knowing the restrictive family trust covenants would inevitably force the startup into sudden, catastrophic eviction. The lawyer projected a timeline onto the massive courtroom monitors, attempting to show that Trent was merely a young, ambitious entrepreneur backed into a desperate corner by a ruthless father-in-law. He argued that the missing $500,000 was never stolen or embezzled for personal gain. He insisted the capital was simply moved into secondary holding accounts to protect the company's assets from my malicious, illegal attempts to seize the startup's intellectual property. The defense painted Trent as a brilliant innovator who was actively sabotaged by a jealous, uneducated mechanic who could not handle his daughter's upward mobility. He loudly accused me of orchestrating the entire financial collapse solely to destroy a marriage I never approved of, forcing Trent to take extreme survival measures. The attorney paced back and forth, attempting to completely obscure Trent's federal crimes beneath a thick layer of smoke mirrors and character assassination. He wanted the jury to believe Trent was a victim of my engineered financial warfare. The federal prosecutor called Hayes to the witness stand immediately following the defense's opening spectacle. Hayes adjusted his tailored jacket, swearing the oath with a calm clinical authority that instantly commanded the room. As a certified forensic accountant and lead financial investigator, his testimony carried ironclad legal weight. The defense attorney immediately attempted to object, claiming Hayes was heavily biased by my direct employment, but the judge overruled the interruption with a sharp wave of his hand. Hayes did not engage in theatrical pacing or emotional appeals. He simply opened a thick black binder and began projecting undeniable hard data onto the courtroom monitors. He systematically dismantled the defense's fabricated narrative piece by meticulous piece. Hayes displayed the exact timestamps of Trent's offshore wire transfers, proving definitively that the mass liquidation of corporate funds began 8 full months before I ever initiated the warehouse eviction. He showed the jury the complex web of Cayman Islands shell companies Trent had personally registered under false identities, completely invalidating the claim that the money was being held to protect the startup. Hayes traced every single stolen dollar, displaying high-definition scans of the luxury purchases, the black market jewelry fencing receipts, and the non-refundable first-class plane ticket to Geneva. He laid out the absolute proof that Trent possessed zero intellectual property to protect. The technology startup was an empty hollow shell utilized solely to extract millions from trusting venture capitalists. Hayes then projected the original $500,000 loan application beside a verified sample of Trent's handwriting provided by a forensic calligraphy expert. The specific pressure points and ink flow matched Trent's penmanship flawlessly, entirely disproving the claim that Morgan had authorized the signature. Hayes delivered the facts with surgical precision, completely incinerating Trent's defense and leaving the arrogant thief exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of federal justice. Morgan sat several rows behind me in the crowded gallery, completely isolated from the surrounding spectators. She looked entirely broken, a fragile shadow of the arrogant high society bride who had confidently insulted me during her lavish wedding reception. Her face was frighteningly pale, her skin entirely devoid of color as she stared blankly at the massive courtroom monitors. She watched in horrified silence as Hayes laid out the clinical, undeniable proof of her husband's absolute depravity. Every financial chart and every forged signature displayed on the screen acted as a physical blow to her shattering reality. She listened to the digital audio recordings the prosecution played, hearing Trent's own voice casually discussing the timeline for liquidating her grandmother's heirloom jewelry. She heard him mock her intelligence to an offshore banking contact, explicitly outlining his plan to leave her completely anchored to the massive commercial debt. Morgan tightly gripped the wooden back of the pew in front of her, her knuckles turning bone white as the horrific scope of the betrayal washed over her. The man she had defended, the aristocratic visionary she had chosen over her own blood, was being clinically dissected and exposed as a ruthless, calculating con artist. She finally saw Trent exactly as he was stripped of his expensive suits and his charming societal armor. There was no remaining delusion to cling to, no sophisticated excuse left to fabricate. The elite fairy tale she had sacrificed her soul to secure was nothing but a predatory financial trap designed specifically to consume her. Morgan lowered her head, her body trembling slightly as the heavy weight of her catastrophic miscalculations pinned her to the wooden bench. The fairy tale was dead, replaced entirely by a cold, devastating truth she could no longer deny or escape. The defense attorney, completely cornered by the overwhelming forensic evidence, executed a desperate final legal maneuver. He called Trent directly to the witness stand. Trent rose from the defense table and walked toward the wooden enclosure, actively attempting to project the sophisticated, aristocratic aura that had historically shielded him from accountability. Despite wearing a shapeless, standard-issue federal prison uniform, he sat down with the relaxed, confident posture of a wealthy CEO addressing a boardroom. He smiled warmly at the diverse jury, utilizing his elite upbringing and polished diction to weave a highly manipulative narrative of victimization. Trent spoke with a measured, hypnotic cadence, completely denying the prosecution's claims. He testified under oath that the complex offshore accounts were nothing more than standard legal corporate tax mitigation strategies commonly utilized by high-level technology firms. He claimed the aggressive financial structuring was simply misunderstood by a blue-collar father-in-law who possessed zero comprehension of modern venture capitalism. Trent painted himself as a brilliant, misunderstood visionary whose cutting-edge startup was deliberately suffocated by my malicious real estate evictions. He looked directly at the jury box, his eyes widening with rehearsed, fabricated sincerity. He insisted he never forged a single document. He boldly stated that Morgan was a fully active, willing participant in securing the commercial loans, explicitly authorizing her signature to support their shared financial future. He leaned forward, resting his hands casually on the polished wood, playing the role of a devoted husband who was actively being framed by a vindictive, uneducated mechanic. His performance was flawless, completely devoid of hesitation or guilt, designed entirely to inject a lethal dose of reasonable doubt into the minds of the jurors. The federal prosecutor approached the podium for cross-examination with the slow, deliberate stride of a predator circling wounded prey. She did not carry a thick stack of complex financial spreadsheets or corporate bylaws. She carried a single small digital audio drive. She looked Trent directly in the eyes and asked him if he considered himself a superior intellect who easily manipulated the working-class people around him. Trent offered a modest, charming denial, maintaining his fabricated humility. The prosecutor did not ask a follow-up question. She simply signaled the court technician to play the primary audio file procured by the federal wiretap during Trent's initial holding cell detention. The courtroom speakers cracked to life with sudden, terrifying clarity. Trent's own unfiltered, panicked voice echoed loudly across the cavernous room, speaking to his offshore black market fence. The jury listened in absolute silence as Trent explicitly bragged about easily scamming his gullible, uneducated black father-in-law. The recording captured him detailing exactly how he utilized Morgan as a disposable financial shield to secure the fraudulent commercial loans. He laughed harshly on the tape, calling his new wife a pathetic, useful idiot who was desperate to buy her way into a superior bloodline. He meticulously outlined his entire strategy to drain the warehouse equity forge, the guarantor signatures, and abandon his marriage the exact moment the corporate accounts were successfully emptied. The stark, undeniable contrast between his charming, polite testimony and the vicious, calculating reality playing over the speakers was entirely devastating. The prosecutor paused the recording and stared at the witness stand. She asked Trent if that sounded like the voice of a misunderstood visionary or the voice of a common, predatory thief actively confessing to federal wire fraud. Trent's carefully constructed aristocratic facade completely and violently disintegrated. The sheer shock of hearing his own unguarded confession played in a federal courtroom short-circuited his ability to maintain his deception. His face flushed a deep mottled red, the veins in his neck bulging visibly against his pale skin. He gripped the heavy wooden edges of the witness stand with white-knuckled force, his entire body shaking with sudden, uncontrollable rage. The polite smile vanished, replaced entirely by a terrifying mask of unfiltered venom. The prosecutor took a single step forward, calmly asking if his elite corporate background gave him the inherent right to steal from a working-class black family. The direct challenge shattered Trent's final ounce of self-control. He lunged forward against the wooden barrier, spittle flying from his lips as he erupted into a furious, unhinged tirade. He screamed that he was inherently superior by birthright and that my money rightfully belonged in his hands because people like me were fundamentally incapable of managing true wealth. He completely lost his mind on the stand. He unleashed a torrent of vicious, unfiltered racial slurs directly into the federal microphone, explicitly degrading my heritage and my labor. He shouted that he was entirely justified in taking whatever he wanted from a family of inferior status. The explosive, violent racism echoed deafeningly off the high ceiling of the courtroom. The jury recoiled in absolute horror, several members physically shrinking back into their seats in open disgust. The presiding federal judge violently slammed his wooden gavel repeatedly, his voice booming over the chaotic noise, demanding immediate order and ordering the defendant to cease his destructive outburst. Trent ignored the judge entirely consumed by his own toxic, deeply ingrained supremacy. The highly paid defense attorney physically collapsed into his heavy leather chair. He buried his face entirely in his hands, aggressively rubbing his temples as his expensive defense strategy burned to ash in real time. He knew with absolute professional certainty that the trial was mathematically and functionally over. His client had just confessed to massive federal fraud while simultaneously demonstrating a vile, unrepentant character to the very people deciding his fate. The judge furiously held Trent in immediate criminal contempt of court, signaling the armed bailiffs. 4 uniformed officers rushed the witness stand simultaneously. They grabbed Trent by his flailing arms, wrenching him violently away from the microphone. He continued to scream racial obscenities and arrogant threats as they dragged him roughly across the courtroom floor toward the side holding cell. His voice echoed down the concrete hallway until the heavy steel door slammed shut, abruptly cutting off his frantic tantrum. I remained perfectly still in the front row of the gallery. I did not flinch, and I did not smile. I simply watched the immediate threat to my family effectively neutralize itself through sheer, unadulterated arrogance. I turned my head slightly and looked toward the back rows. Morgan sat completely frozen, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute unrelenting terror. The man she had chosen over her own father, the sophisticated aristocrat she believed would elevate her social standing, had just publicly revealed himself as a racist, thieving monster. The final shred of her delusional fairy tale was entirely eradicated. The jury stared blankly at the empty witness stand, their faces hardened with undeniable resolve. The formal verdict was now a mere legal formality. Trent had successfully engineered his own absolute destruction. The heavy oak doors of the jury room swung completely shut, sealing the 12 men and women inside to deliberate Trent's fate. Legal experts and journalists whispering in the gallery predicted a swift conclusion, but the absolute speed of the process stunned even the most seasoned federal prosecutors. Exactly 42 minutes after retiring, the jury buzzer sounded through the quiet courtroom. The sudden sharp noise cut through the ambient tension like a physical blow. The bailiff cleared his throat and loudly announced that a unanimous verdict had been reached. The courtroom immediately fell into a suffocating, breathless silence. Trent was escorted back into the room through the side holding cell door. His physical appearance had deteriorated significantly during the brief recess. His face was pale and drawn, his posture rigid with a desperate, deeply suppressed panic. He walked toward the defense table, but his expensive attorney did not stand to greet him, nor did he offer a single word of reassurance. The lawyer simply stared straight ahead, completely detached from the ruined man sitting beside him. I remained perfectly still in the front row, my gaze fixed intensely on the wooden jury box. Morgan sat completely paralyzed 2 rows behind me, her breathing shallow and erratic. The 12 jurors filed back into the room in a single solemn line. They did not look at Trent. They did not glance at the defense table. Their eyes remained firmly locked on the presiding federal judge, projecting absolute, unwavering certainty. The judge adjusted his robes, peering down from the elevated bench with a stern, unforgiving expression. He asked the jury foreperson to stand and read the official findings into the federal record. The foreperson, an older woman with a steady, uncompromising voice, stood up and unfolded the printed verdict sheet. The jury foreperson cleared her throat, her voice echoing with crystalline clarity across the silent federal courtroom. On the primary charge of interstate wire fraud, she pronounced the defendant guilty. Trent flinched visibly, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table as the color completely drained from his face. On the charge of grand larceny relating directly to the systemic theft of corporate funds and private familial assets, the foreperson again declared him guilty. Finally, on the charge of aggravated identity theft stemming directly from the forged commercial lease agreements and unauthorized offshore wire transfers, the verdict was guilty. The word struck Trent like a physical execution. The judge did not hesitate or offer a recess for sentencing deliberations. Trent's explosive racist outburst and explicit confession on the witness stand had entirely stripped him of any potential judicial leniency. The judge struck his heavy wooden gavel, demanding Trent stand to receive his immediate punishment. The judge addressed the defendant with blistering, unrestrained contempt. He systematically outlined Trent's profound lack of remorse, his predatory manipulation of his own wife, and his vile, bigoted arrogance. The judge formally sentenced Trent to a mandatory 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely without the possibility of early parole. The heavy finality of the sentence crashed over Trent, causing his knees to buckle. He swayed heavily against the wooden table, gasping for air as the catastrophic reality of a decade behind bars consumed him. The federal marshals stepped forward instantly, gripping his shoulders with uncompromising force. They did not allow him a single moment to protest or plead. Trent was roughly spun around his hands, swiftly shackled behind his back. The absolute destruction of his elite fraudulent empire was now a legally binding, irreversible fact. As the federal marshals yanked Trent backward toward the holding cell, his desperate, terrified eyes scanned the crowded gallery in a final search for salvation. His frantic gaze abruptly locked onto a tall, imposing figure standing perfectly still near the heavy oak entrance doors. Gregory Trent's immensely wealthy and socially powerful father had quietly slipped into the courtroom during the brief jury deliberation. He wore an immaculate dark navy suit, his posture rigid and commanding. Trent's chest heaved with sudden, desperate hope. He opened his mouth, actively straining against the marshal's iron grip, silently begging his father to deploy his massive financial resources to launch an immediate appeal. He desperately needed Gregory to utilize his elite societal connections to somehow reverse this catastrophic nightmare. Gregory did not move a single muscle to assist his son. He stood with his hands firmly clasped behind his back, staring down at Trent with a cold, absolute disgust that radiated across the room. The patriarch of the prestigious family recognized that Trent had not only failed spectacularly in business, but had publicly humiliated their ancestral name with a vile, unhinged, and criminal spectacle. Gregory's face remained a mask of pure, unforgiving stone. He offered no paternal warmth, no promise of legal rescue, and no sliver of sympathetic grief. He looked at Trent as if examining a repulsive, completely alien creature that had infected his bloodline. Without uttering a single word, Gregory turned his back deliberately on his screaming son. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and walked out of the federal courthouse, letting the doors slam decisively shut behind him. Trent wailed in absolute soul-crushing agony as the marshals forcefully dragged him away. He was now utterly abandoned, officially disowned, and completely erased from his father's powerful legacy. I remained seated until the courtroom completely emptied of the chaotic press and buzzing spectators. The immediate localized threat to my financial security and my family's stability was permanently neutralized in a federal cage. I stood up smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit with slow, deliberate precision. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing faintly against the polished hardwood floor. I passed Morgan's row without stopping or offering a single word of paternal comfort. She sat completely frozen on the wooden bench, her tear-stained face buried deeply in her trembling hands. The crushing weight of the $500,000 forged commercial debt still rested entirely on her shoulders. Trent's federal incarceration did not magically erase the massive legal and financial liabilities she had willingly signed away in her arrogant pursuit of elite social status. I pushed open the heavy courthouse doors and stepped out into the crisp, bright afternoon air. Justice had been ruthlessly served against the man who attempted to steal my hard-earned empire, but my overarching objective was not yet fully achieved. Trent was merely the symptom of a much deeper disease. Morgan had fundamentally disrespected my labor, rejected my heritage, and blindly aligned herself with a predator simply because he wore an expensive suit and possessed a prestigious last name. She was currently mourning the loss of her superficial fairy tale, but she had not yet grasped the profound reality of her own catastrophic choices. She needed to understand the absolute difference between manufactured privilege and earned resilience. I walked steadily toward my parked truck, perfectly satisfied with the day's execution. The first phase of my silent adjustment was flawlessly complete, but the grueling, necessary process of rebuilding my daughter's character had only just begun. The sharp, authoritative knock on the heavy mahogany front door echoed through the cavernous, entirely empty foyer of Morgan's suburban home. The sound carried the distinct, uncompromising weight of financial ruin. Morgan sat curled on the bottom step of the grand staircase, staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor. She possessed zero energy to answer the door, but the knocking persisted, growing louder and more demanding. She slowly pulled herself up, her movements stiff and mechanical, and walked toward the entrance. She pulled the heavy door open to reveal 3 individuals standing rigidly on her front porch. 2 men wore immaculate dark charcoal suits clutching thick leather briefcases, while a uniformed county sheriff stood silently behind them, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. The lead executive did not offer a polite greeting or a sympathetic smile. He stepped forward and handed Morgan a thick stack of legally binding documents printed on heavy, official paper. He introduced himself as the Senior Asset Recovery Director for the commercial lending institution that held the $500,000 note Trent had fraudulently secured. He stated with clinical, devastating precision that the grace period had officially expired. The massive commercial loan had fully defaulted, and the bank was initiating immediate asset seizure protocols to recover their devastating losses. He explicitly explained that the forged signatures on the guarantor forms legally bound her estate to the unpaid corporate debt. Trent had effectively weaponized her marital status to create a financial blast radius that completely consumed her personal assets. The executive informed her that the bank possessed a court-ordered mandate to seize the property and every valuable item remaining inside. The sprawling suburban fortress she had so proudly showcased to her elite social circle no longer belonged to her. The absolute reality of her bankruptcy had finally arrived at her doorstep. The asset recovery team moved past Morgan without waiting for an invitation, stepping into the grand foyer with cold professional efficiency. The senior executive handed her a single roll of heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. He instructed her in a flat, monotone voice that she possessed exactly 1 hour to gather her personal clothing and basic hygienic necessities. Every piece of custom furniture, every high-end electronic device, and every decorative art piece was now officially classified as bank property, to be liquidated against the massive outstanding debt. Morgan took the roll of plastic bags, her hands trembling uncontrollably as the sheer humiliation of the moment paralyzed her. She slowly climbed the grand staircase to the master suite she had meticulously decorated to reflect her supposed aristocratic status. She pulled the plastic bags apart, the harsh tearing sound slicing through the deafening silence of the empty house. She opened her massive walk-in closet and began indiscriminately pulling designer dresses and silk blouses from their velvet hangers, shoving them ruthlessly into the cheap black plastic. The luxurious garments crumpled and wrinkled, completely stripped of their value and elegance. Downstairs, she could hear the sharp mechanical sounds of the recovery team systematically cataloging her possessions. They slapped bright yellow seizure stickers onto the imported Italian leather sofas, the massive flat-screen televisions, and the custom mahogany dining table. They were dismantling her carefully constructed high society illusion piece by piece, reducing her entire life to a calculated list of depreciating assets. Morgan dragged 3 bulging garbage bags into the upstairs hallway, leaving behind rows of empty hangers and bare shelves. She wiped a hot tear from her pale cheek, entirely stripped of the arrogant pride she had wielded like a weapon against her father. The house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene of her own making. The uniformed county sheriff escorted Morgan out the front door precisely 60 minutes after his arrival. The heavy mahogany door shut behind her with a resounding permanent thud, followed instantly by the sharp metallic click of a new industrial deadbolt snapping into place. Morgan stood completely alone on the concrete sidewalk, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly on her exhausted frame. 3 heavy black garbage bags rested at her feet, containing the absolute sum of her worldly possessions. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket, her fingers shaking as she desperately scrolled through her extensive contact list. She dialed the numbers of the wealthy socialites she had desperately courted, the women she had hosted at lavish brunches and expensive charity galas. She called her elite country club acquaintances, pleading for a temporary place to stay or a small financial loan to secure a cheap hotel room. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The few women who did answer offered immediate, thinly veiled excuses before hurriedly disconnecting the line. The high society world she had sacrificed her familial relationships to join had completely evaporated the exact second her financial utility vanished. To the aristocratic circle she worshipped, poverty was highly contagious, and her association with a convicted federal felon made her an absolute social pariah. They discarded her with the same brutal indifference Trent had utilized when he emptied her hidden wall safe. She possessed 0 friends, 0 social capital, and absolutely 0 financial leverage. Morgan stared down at the manicured lawns and pristine driveways of her former neighborhood, fully realizing the profound depth of her isolation. She was entirely homeless, standing on the curb of a life she could no longer afford, surrounded by the invisible walls of a society that had completely rejected her existence. Morgan dropped her phone into her jacket pocket, her chest heaving with a deep, suffocating despair. She reached into her small leather wallet and pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. It was the absolute last piece of physical currency she possessed in the entire world. Her premium credit cards were universally declined, and her joint bank accounts remained frozen under strict federal mandates. She walked to the corner of the immaculate suburban street and hailed a passing municipal taxi. The yellow vehicle pulled up alongside the curb, the driver staring skeptically at her disheveled appearance and the black plastic garbage bags. Morgan did not offer an explanation or a polite greeting. She simply dragged the heavy bags into the back seat and slid in beside them. The driver asked for her destination, his voice carrying a distinct tone of impatience. She handed him the crumpled $20 bill, stating it was all the money she had. She gave him the address to a modest, working-class neighborhood located on the opposite side of the city. It was an address she had not visited in over 3 years, a place she had arrogantly dismissed as beneath her elevated standards. The taxi pulled away from the curb, leaving the sprawling suburban estates far behind. Morgan stared out the smudged window as the city landscape slowly shifted from manicured lawns to practical, densely packed brick houses. She was traveling back to the exact foundation she had so forcefully rejected. She had finally learned the devastating difference between the superficial transactional alliances of elite society and the enduring, unyielding reality of earned resilience. The yellow taxi turned onto the familiar quiet street, slowly approaching the solid brick house where Dwayne lived. The agonizing journey of her ultimate adjustment had finally brought her home. The yellow municipal taxi idled noisily at the curb in front of my solid brick house. I watched through the front bay window as the driver popped the trunk, offering zero assistance, while Morgan dragged her 3 heavy black garbage bags onto the cracked concrete sidewalk. The vehicle sped away, leaving her standing entirely alone in the quiet working-class neighborhood she had spent the last 3 years aggressively pretending did not exist. She looked profoundly out of place. Her designer jacket was violently wrinkled, her posture slumped under the crushing, undeniable weight of her immediate reality. She grabbed the plastic bags by their knotted tops and dragged them clumsily up the familiar concrete walkway. The thin plastic scraped harshly against the pavement, a grating sound that announced her complete and absolute defeat. I opened the front door before she could even reach the top step. Morgan dropped the bags on the porch, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She did not attempt to maintain her usual aristocratic composure. The polished facade was entirely obliterated. She looked up at me with terrified, tear-filled eyes, instantly pleading for sanctuary. She frantically begged me to let her inside, her voice cracking as she described the ruthless bank executives, the sudden foreclosure, and the absolute humiliation of being universally discarded by her elite social circle. She asked to just take her bags upstairs. She wanted to retreat directly into her old childhood bedroom to hide under the familiar blankets of her youth and pretend the catastrophic ruin of her adult life was nothing more than a bad dream. She promised she would not be a burden. She just needed a safe, quiet place to sleep, a fortress where the crushing financial consequences of massive federal fraud could not reach her. I stepped out onto the concrete porch and firmly pulled the heavy mahogany front door completely shut behind me. The brass deadbolt engaged with a sharp, undeniable click. I positioned myself squarely in front of the entrance, physically blocking her path into the house. I did not cross my arms or display overt, aggressive anger. I simply stood my ground with the immovable, cold resolve of a man who had finally drawn a permanent boundary. Morgan lunged forward, her hands reaching frantically for the brass doorknob, but I raised a single hand, halting her progress instantly. I looked directly into her panicked, bloodshot eyes and delivered my answer with absolute, unwavering clarity. I told her she could not come inside. I explicitly stated that her childhood bedroom no longer existed as a protective sanctuary for her to easily escape the devastating consequences of her own deliberate choices. The room had been repurposed, and the free shelter she once took entirely for granted was permanently revoked. Morgan stared at me in stunned silence, her mind struggling furiously to process the firm rejection. She stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the black plastic bags resting on the brick steps, desperately reiterating that she possessed absolutely nowhere else to go. Her premium credit cards were universally frozen, her husband was locked in a federal holding facility, and her high society friends had universally abandoned her. She demanded immediate shelter as a fundamental right of her birth. I maintained my perfectly level gaze, entirely refusing to absorb her mounting panic. I informed her that her lack of alternative housing was a direct result of her own financial arrogance and her blind loyalty to a convicted predator. I was not a temporary safety net to be discarded when she sought elite status and demanded when her superficial empire collapsed. Morgan recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face. The absolute finality of my refusal violently shattered her remaining emotional defenses. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the hard brick porch, burying her face in her hands as violent, racking sobs tore through her chest. She wept with the raw, unfiltered agony of a woman who had just realized the parachute she expected to catch her had been deliberately removed. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears and smeared makeup. She screamed, her voice echoing loudly down the quiet street, asking how a father could possibly leave his own flesh and blood to sleep on the cold concrete. She weaponized the sacred title of father, wielding the word as a blunt instrument designed specifically to induce guilt and force my immediate compliance. I did not flinch, and I did not reach down to comfort her trembling shoulders. I looked at her weeping form and spoke with a cold, surgical precision that cut directly through her raging hysterics. I reminded her of the exact events of her lavish country club wedding. I recounted the precise moment she had explicitly informed me that my working-class presence was a severe embarrassment to her new elevated social standing. I clearly reminded her that she had deliberately chosen Gregory Trent's wealthy, aristocratic father to walk her down the aisle. She had publicly and proudly selected a different father to physically represent her entry into the elite world she so desperately craved. I stated that Gregory was the patriarch she had formally adopted to secure her societal position. Therefore, Gregory was the father she needed to call to rescue her from the sidewalk. I refused to accept the title of father only when it involved cleaning up the catastrophic wreckage. Morgan stared up at me, completely silenced by the undeniable, heavy truth of my words. The hysterical sobbing abruptly stopped, replaced by a hollow, breathless shock. She possessed zero defense against the explicit reality of her own documented cruelty. I stepped closer to the edge of the porch, looking down at the daughter I had sacrificed decades of grueling physical labor to protect. I lowered my voice, speaking with a heavy, profound gravity. I explained that blindly enabling her deeply ingrained entitlement had been my single greatest failure as a parent. For years, I had shielded her from the harsh realities of the world, willingly absorbing the financial blows and silently repairing the massive damage of her reckless decisions. That endless, unconditional financial cushioning had created a woman so thoroughly detached from reality that she willingly signed fraudulent commercial loan documents merely to impress an elite social circle that viewed her as entirely disposable. I explicitly informed Morgan that I would not repeat that fundamental destructive mistake. Allowing her back into the house would merely pause her necessary education. It would validate the toxic belief that she could blatantly disrespect my labor, align herself with predators, and still demand my resources the instant her choices yielded catastrophic consequences. True love required allowing her to stand completely alone in the toxic ashes of her own arrogance. She needed to feel the sharp, unforgiving burn of total financial ruin to finally understand the absolute value of honest labor and authentic loyalty. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a single local shelter address printed on a white index card, and dropped it onto the black plastic bags at her feet. I turned my back on her, unlocked the heavy door, and stepped inside, leaving Morgan to face the impending night entirely on her own. Morgan stood completely paralyzed on the brick walkway, the harsh truth of her father's words echoing in the quiet suburban air. The absolute finality of his rejection anchored her feet to the concrete. She stared at the closed mahogany door, waiting for a reprieve that she suddenly knew was never going to come. Her chest heaved with exhausted, dry sobs. She wiped her smeared mascara with the back of her trembling hand and bent down to grasp the knotted plastic of her 3 garbage bags. The physical effort required to simply lift her remaining worldly possessions felt insurmountable. She turned her back on her childhood home, facing the long, empty street stretching out into the gathering dusk. She possessed absolutely no destination, no money for transit, and no shelter for the impending night. She took one agonizing step forward, her expensive heels scraping awkwardly against the pavement. The sharp mechanical snap of the heavy deadbolt disengaging shattered the evening silence. Morgan froze instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. She turned slowly, terrified that the sound was merely a hallucination brought on by her absolute panic. I stood in the open doorway, my expression completely unchanged, holding a plain brown manila envelope in my right hand. I did not invite her back inside the house. I stepped out onto the porch and extended my arm, offering the thick envelope toward her across the physical distance that separated us. Morgan stared at the worn paper, her eyes darting frantically between my face and the object in my hand. She dropped her plastic bags onto the grass and walked hesitantly back up the concrete steps, viewing the envelope as a sudden, inexplicable lifeline extended over the abyss. Morgan reached out with trembling fingers and took the brown envelope from my grasp. The thick paper felt heavy in her hands. She tore the sealed flap open with frantic urgency, ripping the paper in her desperation to discover whatever financial salvation lay hidden inside. She reached her hand into the opening and pulled out the contents, stopping completely dead as her eyes processed the reality of her lifeline. She did not find a prepaid premium credit card, a check to cover her massive commercial debts, or the deed to a luxury condominium. She held a single worn brass key attached to a cheap plastic tag and a thick stack of stapled black and white employment documents. Morgan stared at the brass key, her brow furrowing in absolute confusion. I informed her with clinical precision that the key belonged to a tiny 300-square-foot studio apartment located deep within the industrial district of the city. The unit sat directly above a loud commercial laundromat, 2 miles away from the nearest high-end boutique or gated community. It offered zero luxury amenities, but it provided a solid roof and a locking door. Morgan slowly unfolded the stapled paperwork, her eyes scanning the bold block letters printed across the top of the first page. It was a standard entry-level commercial janitorial contract. The employment agreement explicitly assigned her to the overnight sanitation crew at the primary Baltimore shipyard. The detailed job description mandated grueling physical labor requiring her to utilize industrial solvents, operate heavy floor buffers, and maintain the sanitation of the massive steel loading bays. Her manicured hands shook violently as she read the meager hourly wage printed at the bottom of the page, a sum that barely covered the cost of her former weekly cosmetic appointments. Morgan looked up from the janitorial contract, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and lingering disbelief. She opened her mouth to argue her deeply ingrained entitlement, instinctively attempting to reject the brutal terms of her new reality. I raised my hand, silencing her before a single complaint could materialize. I spoke with a heavy, unyielding authority, ensuring every word anchored itself permanently in her mind. I explicitly informed her that she was going to scrub the exact same concrete shipyard floors I had scrubbed 30 years ago to put food on our table. I reminded her that she had spent her entire privileged life mocking the working-class labor that funded her private education, her designer clothing, and her elite social access. She was now going to intimately learn the exact physical cost of a single hard-earned dollar. The grueling night shifts at the shipyard would not provide a glamorous lifestyle, but the steady wages would allow her to slowly, painfully chip away at the massive federal restitution and commercial debt Trent had anchored to her name. I made it absolutely clear that I would not pay a single cent toward her legal liabilities. She would earn her survival through sheer unfiltered sweat. If she refused the brass key and the sanitation contract, she was entirely free to walk down the street and test her luck at the municipal homeless shelters. I offered zero negotiation, zero emotional hedging, and zero financial cushioning. The contract in her hands represented the absolute sum of my assistance. It was a raw, unforgiving foundation built entirely on grueling physical labor designed specifically to strip away her manufactured arrogance and force her to construct genuine, durable resilience from the ground up. Morgan stood completely still on the porch, the evening wind biting through her thin designer jacket. The absolute severity of my ultimatum washed over her, systematically extinguishing the final embers of her aristocratic pride. There was no wealthy husband returning to rescue her, no elite social circle to offer her an emergency loan, and no indulgent father waiting to blindly write a check to erase her catastrophic mistakes. She stared down at the brass key and the stapled janitorial contract resting in her trembling hands. The high society illusion she had ruthlessly sacrificed her family to achieve was permanently dead. She slowly closed her hands around the documents, clutching them tightly to her chest. She did not scream, she did not hurl insults, and she did not attempt to negotiate for better terms. The fiery, toxic arrogance that had fueled her betrayal was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, crushing acceptance of her brutal new reality. She looked up at me, her face pale and streaked with dried tears. She offered a single microscopic nod of comprehension, silently accepting the grueling path laid out before her. Morgan turned away from the heavy mahogany door, walking slowly back down the concrete steps toward the sidewalk. She bent down and gripped the thin plastic ties of her 3 garbage bags, hauling them up with a heavy, exhausted sigh. She did not look back at the suburban house that had shielded her from the world for her entire life. She dragged her meager belongings down the quiet street, heading toward the nearest public transit stop to begin her long journey toward the industrial district. I watched her disappear into the deepening shadows, completely satisfied that the painful, necessary process of her true education had officially begun. 6 months had passed since the heavy mahogany door had slammed shut on Morgan's former life, replaced entirely by the deafening rhythmic clatter of the Baltimore shipyard. The cavernous steel loading bays offered zero comfort and no aesthetic luxury, only the sharp chemical sting of industrial-grade solvents and the unrelenting chill of the midnight shift. Morgan gripped the heavy, vibrating handles of an industrial floor buffer, leaning her entire body weight into the massive machine as it ground away layers of grease and grime from the scarred concrete. She wore a shapeless, standard-issue gray jumpsuit, the thick fabric stained with sweat and harsh cleaning chemicals. Her hands, once meticulously manicured and soft, were now covered in thick calluses and raw blisters. The excruciating physical labor demanded every ounce of her energy, leaving absolutely no room for self-pity or lingering delusions of grandeur. She pushed the heavy buffer down the long, echoing corridor, her muscles burning with a deep, persistent ache that had become her constant companion. She did not stop to rest, and she did not complain to the gruff shift supervisor monitoring the floor. When the machine finally powered down, she grabbed a heavy mop and a bucket of boiling, soapy water, attacking the tight corners the buffer could not reach. The brutal repetition of the work had systematically stripped away the toxic layers of her manufactured entitlement. Every agonizing hour spent scrubbing the shipyard floors directly funded the massive financial restitution she was legally mandated to pay. She was slowly, painfully buying back her own independence, one grueling shift at a time. The superficial, arrogant woman who had demanded elite social status was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, resilient worker who finally understood the absolute, undeniable value of honest labor. 200 miles away, the sterile, unforgiving reality of a maximum security federal penitentiary had completely consumed Trent. The sprawling, fraudulent empire he had built on manipulation and elite entitlement was now reduced to a damp concrete cell measuring exactly 6 by 8 feet. He sat slumped on a remarkably thin mattress, staring blankly at the heavily reinforced steel bars that separated him from the rest of the world. He wore a faded, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his diminishing frame. The sophisticated, aristocratic aura that had historically functioned as his ultimate shield was entirely eradicated, replaced by the hollow, terrified posture of a broken man. He possessed no access to high-end grooming products, tailored suits, or offshore bank accounts. The other inmates did not care about his prestigious last name or his former position in the venture capital sector. In this brutal environment, he was nothing more than another convicted felon serving a mandatory 12-year sentence. Every day was a monotonous, agonizing cycle of loud sirens, harsh fluorescent lights, and strict, uncompromising authority. He spent his long, isolated hours waiting desperately for a legal update or a sign of paternal intervention that he fundamentally knew was never going to arrive. Gregory had completely severed all ties, publicly disowning Trent and utilizing his massive financial resources to erase the disgraced son from the family's legacy. Trent gripped the edge of his metal bunk, his knuckles turning white as the crushing weight of his permanent abandonment settled over him. The toxic superiority and racial arrogance he had proudly wielded during his disastrous courtroom testimony had engineered his absolute destruction. He was permanently trapped in a cage of his own making, entirely stripped of the unearned privilege that had defined his entire existence. I sat on my front porch in the quiet stillness of the late afternoon, holding a chipped ceramic mug filled with dark, bitter coffee. The suburban street was entirely peaceful, bathed in the soft, fading light of the approaching evening. I rested a small, silver-framed photograph on my knee, staring down at the warm, smiling face of my late wife, Yvonne. The picture had been taken nearly 30 years ago, capturing a moment of profound, simple happiness, long before the destructive forces of wealth and elite ambition had infected our bloodline. I traced the edge of the frame with a calloused thumb, breaking the profound silence with a quiet, steady voice. I spoke directly to the woman who had shared my deepest struggles, offering her a final, comprehensive accounting of our daughter's grueling journey. I told Yvonne that the agonizing process of breaking Morgan's entitlement was the single most difficult task I had ever executed. It required actively suppressing every deeply ingrained paternal instinct to protect and provide, deliberately forcing our only child to face the catastrophic ruin of her own choices. I explained that catching her when she fell would have only perpetuated the toxic cycle, guaranteeing she would remain forever bound to predators who viewed her as a disposable asset. I had to let her crash into the concrete foundation of absolute poverty so she could finally learn how to rebuild herself with genuine, unbreakable strength. I looked at Yvonne's smiling face and quietly stated that the ruthless strategy had successfully worked. Morgan was currently earning her survival through sheer honest sweat, completely untethered from the fraudulent aristocratic illusions that had nearly destroyed her. I had to become the villain in her fairy tale to ultimately save her life. The sky above the quiet working-class neighborhood slowly transitioned from a brilliant piercing blue to deep shades of amber and crushed violet. I remained seated on the sturdy wooden porch, watching the sun dip steadily below the jagged silhouette of the city skyline. The fading light cast long, familiar shadows across the cracked concrete walkway, entirely erasing the lingering ghosts of the chaotic, destructive year that had just passed. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp evening air fill my lungs completely. For the first time in over 3 years, the suffocating tension that had gripped my chest finally dissolved. The agonizing vigilance, the calculated legal maneuvering, and the brutal emotional discipline required to execute my overarching strategy were no longer necessary. The fraudulent commercial debt was actively being paid down through legitimate, grueling labor. The manipulative predator who had attempted to steal my legacy was permanently neutralized behind heavy steel bars. Most importantly, the daughter I had almost lost to the toxic allure of elite society had miraculously found her way back to reality. She was safe, she was working, and she was finally learning the true value of her own existence. I took a final sip of the dark, bitter coffee, setting the heavy mug down onto the wooden railing with a quiet, decisive thud. I picked up Yvonne's silver-framed photograph, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of completion settling over my entire being. The house behind me was silent, secure, and entirely my own. The ruthless, necessary war for my family's actual soul had been fought and decisively won. I watched the last sliver of the sun disappear over the horizon, fully realizing that the silent adjustment was now officially and permanently complete. True love is not defined by endless accommodation or blinding financial protection. It requires the profound, agonizing courage to allow those we cherish to experience the devastating consequences of their own arrogance. Shielding a person from reality only breeds toxic entitlement and dangerous vulnerability. Genuine character cannot be inherited or purchased. It must be forged through the grueling crucible of accountability and honest labor. Sometimes stepping aside and letting someone hit rock bottom is the ultimate way to save their soul. Real resilience rises from the ashes of ruined illusions, building a foundation that no predator can ever permanently shatter. Subscribe now to receive more uncompromising stories of truth, resilience, and the brutal reality of earned redemption.